achieved its goal. That isn't a moral goal, it's just the goal. Represent the broad opinion of the widest adult demographic. Low information voters, single-issue voters, and unempathetic, self-interested voters are all pervasive archetypes that democracies around the world face every single election. Seeing these issues play out in a microcosm in a medieval point-and-click adventure game is as funny as it is interesting. Finding a balance between education and voice is paramount to fostering a mutually beneficial ecosystem. With this in mind, why the hell does every single poll seem to pass? To begin understanding this, we need to ground our axioms, which is a pretentious way of saying we need to agree on certain fundamental truths, in this case, about the voting populace. 1. People are afraid of change when things are going well. 2. People want what is best for themselves and through that lens, what is best for the game. And 3. People are generally going to value their personal interests over those of people they've never met or considered. Now that we are definitely all in agreement with that, right, we can infer the quote-unquote elite opinion alongside the quote-unquote common opinion. In this situation, elite would be those who have the most experience and knowledge on the subjects being polled. For example, high-end PVMers, maxed players, talented PvPers, and so on. The commoner would be a conglomerate of everyone else, although even that is oversimplifying things since it isn't uncommon for someone with a less impressive account to have more knowledge on certain things because they have simply invested more time into understanding the complexities of the game outside of playing it. For example, you don't need a maxed account to develop great content for old school RuneScape. Jimmy likely understands the social systems of RuneScape far more than the average Sanguine Sam who has a net friend list of 6 identical looking scythers. That's because much of his content is spent experiencing those systems, often anonymously. On the other hand, No Monkey is a much more knowledgeable voice on endgame PVM and PVM in general. I hope neither of them mind me saying that. These two brackets can be used to divide collective thought and justify certain outlooks. For example, a common observation that is masked as a criticism is that people just want updates. This is true, they do, and that is why new content is more likely to be seen positively. When all you have as a player is a fancifully worded blog from Jagex, a pitch, your mind runs wild. Your imagination goes to either extreme, and if the proposition is generally positive, like a new boss, then you become a lot more excited for that. We want updates, and we're fed blogs that make these updates sound awesome. The nice thing is, they usually are, thanks to Jagex's talented development team, but that benefit of the doubt is only established thanks to a positive track record, one that is tested every time something entirely new gets polled. Just look at how contentious sailing is. This observation leveraged as a criticism is aimed at the commoner archetype. It's loaded with the presumption that these people don't care or are unaware of the needs for longevity and sustainability, and instead just want something that sounds flashy or cool. Quite frankly, yeah, that's standard in democracy, appealing to summary. If you live in a democratic society, especially a representative democracy, then you get pitched these kinds of ideas all the time. A politician may saunter up on stage, promise the world, and then deliver just short of nothing. If only our politicians were as good as our OSRS devs, am I right? Jokes aside, this is the only functional way to operate in a democracy. To shift this example back to RuneScape, Jagex can't develop out an entire update before pitching it. Not only is that unbelievably wasteful, it's also not feasible on, like, any schedule. But we'll talk about that later on. Hey, I just want to thank everyone for watching this video. It took a ton of time to research and create, so it means the world to me that you are spending your time with it. If you enjoy the video, consider liking and subscribing, and if you really like my content and have disposable income to support a YouTuber, consider joining as a member. You get some emotes and even a shout out at the end of the video. And let me know what you think of the polling system as it functions in 2025 below. This community is by and large one of the most traumatized I've ever been a part of. There is a lot of negativity by a vocal minority aimed at new content because of RuneScape's history being tumultuous, to say the least. From a host of enormously damaging updates that scarred the game in the late 2000s to the infamous Evolution of Combat release in 2012, which saw the departure of 70 to 80% of the player base within a year. It is reasonable to be cautious, but it's important to have context. The developers behind those contentious updates aren't the ones updating the game today, and even more importantly, developers are people capable of change and growth. If we can use the past to contextualize and influence our current feelings toward future updates, then it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume people who have spent decades learning how to develop games would also be capable of doing that. It is not unrealistic to assume that every single old school RuneScape developer is painfully aware of the game's history and is more than a little cautious about implementing systems like that into OSRS. With all that said, the negativity stems from the old guard. An influx of new players has slowly softened the edges of the community, and as the influx becomes a majority, we enter a new era wherein no majority is traumatized by past mistakes. They aren't fear-mongering over every update, and in a more critical sense, they aren't aware of some of the pitfalls that could damage the game overall. You can only learn from history if you're aware of it. Finally, it's worth noting that most games don't survive even a fraction of the time RuneScape has. Through all of these past failures, somehow it's still standing. So back to the earlier criticism aimed at more casual players, we need to recognize that updates and pushing the game forward has always been the ethos of RuneScape and the standard to which every live service game is held. You are not being unreasonable or stupid for feeling positively about upcoming updates just because there's something new. Stagnation is the beginning of failure, and uprooting stagnation is much harder than preventing it in the first place. You will not be able to name a single MMO on Earth that has retained success without changing or evolving something. It's just not possible. OSRS certainly isn't an example, considering the game in 2013 is so obviously different than what we play today, and during its launch when they really weren't adding any interesting updates at all apart from like the Nightmare Zone, is that even an interesting update? It's not. The game was pretty much on the verge of death, averaging less than 20,000 concurrent players, which by the way is like 10 times less than what we see today. It's actually less than what RuneScape 3 sees today. Take a look at the updates released during the original golden age of RuneScape from 2004 to 2008, let's say. Over the course of this 4-year period, we saw dozens of quests, more than half a dozen new areas, enormous power creep yearly, and a trailblazing attitude. I think it is unhealthy for the future of the game to view the word evolution as negative, just because of its association with the evolution of combat. That is more true today than ever before, considering old school RuneScape has seen countless points of evolution throughout the past decade. These things just weren't called evolutions. The ability to move your camera with the middle mouse button rather than the arrow keys is transformative to the way you play. Plugins are arguably more individually impactful than any other update in the game's history. Raids are an evolution of the game's player versus environment fundamentals, even down to the kinds of mechanics introduced with newer PvM updates. And that's not even mentioning the fleshed out skilling bosses and minigames that have essentially replaced certain skills outright. Everything here is drastically different than what we've seen between 2004 and 2008. but each one of these updates, likely barring plugins, are things we could have seen at that time. That is the ethos of RuneScape. Hell, it's the ethos of every successful live service game. For a moment, I want you to question whether the developers in 2006 would have completely dismissed sailing as a skill, or if they simply did not have the infrastructure to create it. Being daring and transformative is good. Resting on your laurels is not. That is why old school RuneScape almost died in 2014 prior to it receiving properly innovative updates. Even Zulrah, by the way, was unlike any other PVM encounter. Like, you can immediately tell that was a modern RuneScape encounter as opposed to like God Wars Dungeon 1. Similarly, it's why this channel is so dedicated to comparing RuneScape to other MMOs that have stagnated by not challenging their audience and evolving their format. This all feeds into the concept of checks and balances. Politically, checks and balances is an infrastructural system that allows different branches of government to moderate each other in an effort to prevent any single branch from becoming too powerful or corrupt. In RuneScape, this is a social system as well as an infrastructural one. The social element stems from the prior dichotomy of elite and common players. It is paramount that the elite have a voice of knowledge and caution that restrains the common player from venturing too deep into the woods, changing too many of the fundamentals and losing the game in the process. Meanwhile, the common player pushes the elite into accepting more creative, innovative, and transformative ideas. These two sides balance each other out, and seeing the value in each one is crucial to having an equally balanced perspective on the game's polling system. The infrastructural element is the developers themselves. The entire player base checks the developers' work, and in balancing player and developer insight, we achieve a productive, healthy harmony for the game's future. It, much like any democracy, is a tightrope. At any given time, things can slip, and it's up to all of us, collectively, to have enough support and belief in the system's power to realign ourselves and avoid falling entirely. I'm not arguing for faith as much as I'm arguing against reactionary responses. If one innovative update fails, that doesn't mean we ought now vote against every other innovative update. Just because the evolution of combat was a disaster on launch doesn't mean every point of evolution is now permanently corrupted. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, people want updates. They vote updates in, even when those updates aren't always healthy to the game. Yet, the vast majority of updates introduced into the game are healthy. If we are to look at the dozens upon dozens of updates over the past 2 years, we'd be hard-pressed to pick more than a handful that are outwardly damaging. This is a multifaceted issue, of course, because the idea of what is and isn't damaging is subjective. There are players who think every single update is horrible because they prefer the game as it once was. For this video, when I say healthy and not, assume I am referring to the only objective metric for that: consistent player-based growth. If the numbers keep going up, then we can only assume that the game is operating healthily, and the numbers are looking good. One of the more nuanced changes in polling over the past decade has been in the kinds of things being polled. New players have certainly impacted in a lessening of dread over any new thing being added, but developers have learned what players are more amicable to. A reason why so many polls pass is because most of the things being polled are both player suggested and developer filtered. It'd be difficult to work on a game for a decade and not begin to understand what the user base enjoys and doesn't, and then focusing specifically on elements enjoyed. Some of the most contentious polls in the history of the game have included out there ideas that more than likely were destined to fail. And the other form of failed polling is with relatively minor updates that kick up a major uproar. On the former, the most widely despised poll was 2017's Partnership and RuneScape. This was an MTX adjacent idea that saw Jagex join key partners in the gaming world and release cosmetics into the game that become available for members at a later date. It should go as no surprise that even though it did not explicitly include MTX, this idea was hated, failing every single poll question. This went against the value of cosmetics as items obtained in-game and clearly overstepped for most players. It was never polled again, in any form. On the latter point, smaller updates tend to be those that see the most discourse for whatever reason. Here's Jagex suggesting they remove a green pixel from the construction icon. This poll failed, half as a meme and half as a genuine interest in retaining things that don't really hurt anyone but are seen as old school. Reddit user BiomasterZap aggregated some interesting data on the history of polling in old school. You can find his entire post in the description, but one of the findings is that yes, over the course of the last decade, updates have begun to pass more polls, going from a 70% pass rate in 2014 to a 92.75% pass rate since 2020. But we can also track similar trends. One obvious point to keep in mind is how many more users are voting on average. While the average percentile of active players voting is less, the amount of votes overall is greater because of how many more players there are in 2025 than 2013. That isn't to say that polls aren't representative of overall opinion though, because general aggregates rely on less data than 60-odd thousand votes, but the friction of voting itself will be something we talk about later on. It's also worth noting that the pass rate has remained static since the COVID bump in player numbers, indicating further that an influx of new players has led to a more positive attitude toward content updates. All of this should also show you how much more faith the overall player base has in Jagex now, as compared to 2014 when any single update could destroy what's kind of already working. Votes are also more likely to represent a more experienced player's opinion than a very casual new player's opinion. Not because everyone voting is a max cape wearing GigaChad, but because the process of voting itself is just not really pushed toward players who are far more casual in their day-to-day engagement. Only in the larger, more transformative suggestions, such as sailing, do we see double or even triple the amount of votes being cast. The more contentious an election, the more turnout for the average voter. Sailing is a great example, because even though the skill passed multiple polls, it is still viewed as controversial because of how slim the margin was and how Jagex pivoted the supermajority standard from 75% to pass to 70% to pass. While 70% is still far greater than most democracies, it is natural to be a little skeptical that this change came alongside such a big question. That said, it's worth noting that 80.9% of players voted for a new skill, so whether a new skill is added or not is simply not up for debate. That passed both metrics. Then, after a skilling consultation poll, Jagex introduced the actual poll for the skill itself, wherein they posited 3 options and let a plurality decide what is the most appropriate choice: shamanism, taming, and sailing. A plurality vote is just looking for a majority choice between the 3, not requiring 70 or 75% in favor. Overall, the turnout was rather large for an OSRS poll and saw shamanism and sailing neck and neck in the first question, asking which of these suggestions would players want to see further fleshed out. In the very same threefold vote, the second question was asking what skill players are more interested in, and in that regard, sailing had a more decisive victory. Personally, I think the first question is somewhat useless if the result will just default to the winner of the second question, but this is hindsight indicating something Jagex could have avoided. Finally, sailing was polled again in the summer of 2023, where it won 71.9% of the vote and began its official development. It's still contentious, and it's not unlikely that if Jagex didn't change the supermajority standard and sailing still received 75% of the vote, then people would still be upset because a large portion of players disappointed by this are those who fit into the category of people averse to game-altering changes, mostly due to the past painting over RuneScape's updates in a negative light. Their criticisms are reasonable, and their concerns are too. That's part of the checks and balances of the process, but ultimately the supermajority gets what they voted for because that's how democracy works. We don't just repoll things because people who lost are extra loud. Talking about losing, let's investigate Wilderness and PvP. Barring some bizarre outliers like the Jagex partner cosmetic thing, PvP and Wilderness updates have always been the most contentious. There really haven't been many, if any, Wilderness-focused polls that unanimously passed all of their questions, and that's for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, the majority of players don't PvP, me included. Because of that, they don't want a chunk of the developer's time and resources dedicated to this content. That's the self-interest of a voter coming into play. Second, there's a not-so-quiet section of voters who hate PvP and vote against it out of spite. These are often single-issue voters. PvP is by nature more toxic, and therefore your experience with it as a non-PvPer is likely to be more toxic as well. You begin to associate it negatively. And finally, this is all kind of Jagex's fault. I don't PvP, but I think old school RuneScape has the most interesting PvP scene of any MMO. The combat plays so well into the PvP framework, and the skill gaps are more immediately recognizable by observers in RuneScape than other MMOs such as World of Warcraft, where the PvP can look like a flurry of nonsense that anyone who doesn't play the game is unable to distinguish. As a new player, I found it pretty easy to appreciate PvP in OSRS, even if I didn't fully grasp the tactics behind it yet, because it doesn't take a keen eye to see just how impressive the precision and timing of the best players is, and that's what made events like Deadman All-Stars both entertaining and awe-inspiring. As I have said in prior videos, PvP in RuneScape is more similar in its appreciation to Counter-Strike than World of Warcraft. It also forgoes the rhythmic nature of the game's PvM in favor of freeform and sporadic behavior. In an older video, I compared it to improvisational jazz and got a copyright claim for doing so. It's Jagex's fault in that their choices to interconnect PvP and PvM has led to a large swath of voting PvMers to associate only negativity with PvP. The Wilderness bosses are a great example of this. On the surface, they're a good idea. Find a way to get PvMers into the Wilderness to give PKers something to hunt. These bosses yield disproportionately high returns on their commons, so they are very likely to be great gold per hour. The issue stems from the inclusion of the Void Waker unique. While every common can be obtained elsewhere, albeit in lesser quantities, the Void Waker cannot. It is bespoke to the Wilderness, and if you are an Iron Man who wants to obtain it, you must put yourself through the Wilderness boss meat grinder for dozens of hours. Personally, I associate the Wilderness as an Iron Man with nothing but negativity, awful clue steps, awful bossing experiences, and minimal reward other than those you obtain from the bosses themselves. That's in part due to the hunter-prey dynamic, but also because Iron Men don't get anything from fighting back against the encroaching PKer. You're an Iron Man. Even if you kill them, you can't loot anything, you're still wasting time and resources. As a main, if you manage to counter PK someone, at least you're rewarded for that effort. As an Iron, you aren't. You are still punished. For the record, I'm not saying you should let Iron Men loot their kills, that'd be insane. But considering Iron Men make up around 30% of the player base, which I would think is larger than the entire PvP community, that subsection is more than likely predisposed to associating negativity with the Wilderness, especially due to the way this content is interconnected with their PvM journey. It's always going to be an uphill climb. I'm part of this camp. Anytime I see more PvM being pulled for the Wilderness, I cringe. I don't want to be there, and I don't want more content being gated by it. I already feel obligated to grind the Void Waker, even though every moment is frustrating as hell. It doesn't help that this content is incredibly competitive both with real players and bots, and the most beneficial way of engaging with it is by setting up an alternate account outside of the boss arena's entrance to keep an eye out for pesky PKers. The barrier to entry is astronomical for content that isn't as much reliant on skill as it is tolerance. A slight tangent, but Jagex has made 3 great mid-game bosses that would certainly expand options for new players exploring Gillinor. Each wilderness boss teaches crucial mechanics and is quite fun and relaxing to do. Sadly, because I have my alt perched out by the entry point, my emotions are mainly that of anxiety. My maybe controversial suggestion is to add solo versions of the wilderness bosses elsewhere, drastically nerf the commons, I'm talking by like 90%, and buff 2 of the 3 garbage rings they drop. Remove the wilderness specific weapon upgrades and reconsider the Void Waker. With very minor changes, the mid-game grows exponentially, becoming even more fun. Meanwhile, the wilderness bosses retain their huge appeal as a source of income. The more edgy take may be to argue that the Void Waker should be able to be obtained elsewhere too, but I'll let that be a topic for another time. The main counterpoint to my complaining is just saying, don't do it then. And sure, that's reasonable, but it's also not going to make more people amicable to these polls. The average voter isn't likely to vote yes to something that they won't ever do and feel as though it encroaches on content they otherwise would. By voting against a new PVM in the wilderness, the average voter may feel that this content will make its way outside of the wilderness eventually. The solution to this is complicated, and that stems from the fact that removing PVM incentives from the wilderness would likely kill PKing. It won't kill PvP because there are plenty of avenues for high-skill players to duke it out via bounty hunter, NHing, and so on. But PKing is a facet of the game, like it or not. The remaining area for it would be revenants, but even those are quite controversial in the community. It doesn't take an impressive understanding of player psychology to understand why a subsection feels negativity toward a piece of content that is defined by coercing people who don't want to PvP into PvP. It's normal to feel sad or even angry that some dude with far more gear and experience than you is crip walking over your corpse while you were just fighting a boss at half health. I want to reiterate that it's okay to have this in the game. I hate being in the wilderness, but it's a unique and identifiable feature of RuneScape that does have a ton of value. But let's not be surprised at some of the negativity toward it. Remember, the only way for people to feel like their voices are being heard is by voting. I would like to see Jagex take another look at how to retain PvP as a thriving community while not utilizing this pre-existing dynamic for hunting randoms as a crutch. I think there are far more interesting methods of enhancing the wilderness that aren't only creating instanced battle arenas like Bounty Hunter. But again, that's a topic for another time and likely one for another person because I'm very not good at PvP, surprise surprise. Polls pass more consistently. That's because newer players are less cautious while developers are more cautious. Beyond just the understanding of how new players may look at a proposed update, there is likely something else at play. This is where we get even deeper into assumption and inference. I want to preempt everything in this section by saying I have never spoken to any Jagex moderator or developer. I am using my pre-existing knowledge and research to come to what I hope are reasonable conclusions. A development pipeline is a structured method of managing workflow. It's a way to allocate resources in a business to produce the best and quickest results. In game development, a pipeline is used for like everything, such as in RuneScape, it may take you from early conceptualizations, to polling, to previs, to grayboxing, to early testing, to QA, and to release. It is the entire process of content creation, and different games have different kinds of pipelines that work for them. RuneScape is interesting in that I assume it to be far more agile than your average game. To pull from my extensive history with World of Warcraft for a moment, there were interviews back in 2020 and 2021 wherein the lead director discussed how long it took for Blizzard to react to player feedback because of how far ahead the development was to what is currently released. By the time an expansion launches, they're already developing the next one, thinking more than 2 years into the future. The core systems have already been locked in 2 years prior to its release. This is why when a negative trend is seen in Blizzard's design philosophy, it took them half a decade to fix it. Nowadays, supposedly, things are a bit more agile and responsive, but judging by what I've seen, it has its own set of issues such as innumerable bugs in their patch launches. RuneScape is fascinating because it doesn't have the ability to develop content far into the future because, as per the topic of this video, everything is polled and is expected to release relatively close to when it passes the poll, at least in part. There are ways for the developers to use their historic knowledge and growing knowledge of the player base to predict poll results and begin developing more complex content earlier. I can't confirm if this is what happens or if the turnaround for OSRS content is truly as fast as it seems, but if an upcoming poll was a sure thing, such as one for a new raid would be, I wouldn't be surprised if the developers had already created concept art and began previs without fear that all of that work would be for nothing. That may explain how Yama was announced, polled, and released within a few months, even though the fight itself is one of the most complex encounters ever created for the game. A new, cool duo boss is not going to fail a poll, and it didn't, with over 90% of the voters voting yes. Of course, this is a risk, but it may be one worth taking for the benefit of the development pipeline, because content releases in old-school RuneScape are becoming larger and larger. Varlamore, the newest continent, was split into 3 parts, but any individual part likely housed more content than the entire continent of Koren did on its release. That's not even considering the polish and aesthetic being better as well. Remember, Koren had to be reworked and iterated on for years after its launch. Varlamore will not. Larger polls like these are often very successful. Generally speaking, transformative content is more contentious than expansive content. Expansive not always in size, but in addition, as in it adds to something that already exists. An expansion to the game world, an expansion to a skill with a new Slayer creature or minigame, and so on. Transformative content is a new skill. It's entirely new, and due to the way OSRS interconnects all of its systems, it would impact everything else. Funnily, the other kind of controversial suggestion is often minor. As I outlined earlier, it's changing a pixel in the construction icon or even something like the proposed changes to the chivalry prayer. I want to hesitate to take a firm stance on this because I am not fully aware of all the issues people have with this question. I looked around, but honestly, I don't know. The poll itself was suggesting a minor adjustment that would likely involve a couple strings of code and a few days of testing. Once again, the controversiality of this question stemmed in no small part from its connection with PvP and the wilderness. To alleviate some of the stresses of polling, Jagex implemented an entirely new concept called Game Health Updates. These are unpolled changes that developers have determined are an abject positive for the game. It is a distinctly undemocratic shift, but one that is perfectly reasonable in my opinion. Blowpipe nerfs, for example, were certainly needed as the power of this item suffocated Jagex's ability to develop new range gear. However, even after most agreed on that, you could still see a section of negativity stemming from it because whether healthy or not, nerfs are almost always viewed poorly by the most single-issue voters of them all. A nerf feels bad. I have an entire video discussing the nerfs to Yama's unique drop rate and the response to that, even though the nerf itself still retained an endgame encounter that took less time to greenlog than every other endgame encounter. Nerfs to drop tables are seen the same way. Economy-focused players feel explicitly attacked by reducing the consistent value of an encounter or method. Game health updates seek to skirt this issue. On one hand, Jagex shoulders the blame for their failures. On the other hand, Jagex has become good at identifying issues and framing them in such a way as to minimize player negativity. Reactionary reproaches in game spaces are as common as rain in London. It's expected that whenever there is even a slight hint of something being done poorly, the, I don't know, old school RuneScape subreddit devolves into outrage for a week. It's the same paradigm that the outrage media cycle operates through anywhere else, just done in the microcosm of player-driven echo chambers. It's important to recognize two things. Every update will always have its detractors, and that the vocal minority consensus is not popular consensus. Even if we are to support the polling system, we need to retain its most fundamental truths. Most recently, we had the Summer Sweep Up, a whole host of amazing changes aimed at PvM encounters, from fixing pain points in the tomes of a Masket to making Fasani's Nightmare slightly more tolerable.
Wow.
Oh shit! Oh shit. Oh, fuck. With that came some drop rate nerfs and loot rebalances, some of which are more contentious than others. Purple rates in TOA were nerfed outright, but partly balanced by the raid becoming far less tedious to do. Similarly, Jagex sought to rebalance the seed table to bring value back to certain items that were deemed too common, such as Torstals in TOA. I have my fair share of criticisms for the seed changes, but honestly, that will have to be a conversation for a different time because this video is already extremely long. The issue with democracy is ever present in RuneScape as well as the rest of the world, but having issues isn't always reason to destroy the system altogether. The arguments that swell within the populace are often aimed at the populace. They are groups of people that blame each other for the direction of their country and their game, because democracy gives voice to those who differ from you. It's educated people, in this case those who are far more experienced in the game, wanting to be the sole voices steering the game toward a healthier future. It's low information or one-issue voters, in this case more casual players, wanting a more approachable and exciting future for the game. We run into the same problems we do in real life. If we are to default to experts in determining the future of our country or content, then we wouldn't be polling anything. The ultimate authority that has more knowledge than even maxed players are literally the game developers currently working on RuneScape. Yet, much like anyone else, they are privy to biases, oversights, and all kinds of other mistakes. Much like the elite players are, much like anyone is. That's why a system of checks and balances is so crucial. Every one of those three horsemen I mentioned are attributable to the elite as much as they are to the commoner. Regardless of if you've played the game for a day or a decade, you are more likely to vote in favor of your own self-interests. You are still more likely to vote for simplicity if it actually impacts whatever grind you're currently doing. It is only in retrospect do certain things need to stay the same.
I'm still waiting for someone to submit the petition to remove the agility and stamina bar from the game. I'm signing that instantly. And you can't stop me. I have the right to vote. The only way I would not vote to have stamina removed is if I have 99 agility, in which case I've earned it, so everyone else has to earn it too. But I'm not there yet, so I'm voting for it to be removed.
That's why having new players vote is incredibly important, because they are the only ones who are actually experiencing the game's onboarding and early game. It's crucial feedback for Jagex to grow RuneScape. Without them, there may be a very real chance that we would have hit a market cap for OSRS growth years back, because all new players are instantly repelled by the game's obtuse early game. And late game, elite players are less likely to see value in last year's influx of mid and early game updates, from the absolute banger that is Scurious to one of my favorite pieces of content in old school RuneScape, Perilous Moons. Having a game without these things would be sad. Having a stagnant early game would make creating new accounts far less exciting. I may be speaking only for myself here, but seeing all the awesome early and mid-game content has made me excited to create a hardcore Iron Man whenever I decide to do that, because my progression path would be so different than what it once was. RuneScape's issue can actually be more so in its direct democracy. You can't strictly determine a country's direction by only appealing to majorities within affluent cities, for example, while ignoring millions who live in the countryside. Their day-to-day lives are too different to account for one another, they cannot consider each other's preferences, and should not be marginalized because of that. The goal for all players is to have the game grow, but achieving growth looks different depending on who you talk to. And honestly, Max Cape Matt isn't particularly concerned with the new player experience that he hasn't done in 15 years, much like Bronze Bobby isn't super passionate about hard mode, Inferno, Colosseum, Nightmare, Soul, Echo version. The answer to all of this is, of course, a balance. But that balance is difficult to strike with only a majority-driven conclusion driving the future of the game. The benefit of representative democracies, whether they be the two-party system like in America or parliamentary systems like in many European countries, is that the votes go to the people who advocate for quieter voices as well, rather than suffocating those voices in the din of public discourse and majority disposition. I'm unsure how to implement that into old school RuneScape, and God knows representative democracies have their own host of many issues, so I will try and advocate for something everyone can contribute to in their own way. This is not so much a solution as a twofold suggestion. The first step is to educate. Help push channels into the mainstream that can fill the gaps of knowledge in a productive way. A great example of this for PvM content is No Monkey. His videos don't just reach the top percentile of players because a portion of his subscribers are looking for guides and are therefore less experienced. This reality can curate healthy game opinions through an appeal to a pretty reasonable authority espousing educated, quote-unquote, elite opinion. That's not to say I agree with everything No Monkey says. In fact, my group Iron Man partner and I had a running joke for a while that whenever a new boss comes out and No Monkey says it's bad or unfun, then we are likely to love it, like Araxor. We inhabit different skill levels and different outlooks, but it's hard to deny the benefit of experience. He is able to speak on the long-term health of the endgame, even if he, much like anyone else, is predisposed to biases too. You can find his channel linked in the description, and also comment your own favorite guide maker as well, because there are plenty of incredible voices helping educate players on PvM, skilling, and everything else. Education can also be influenced in-game, not just through positive mentorships in clans and pugs, but by developers themselves. Create systems that remove some of the friction from communication. Better, more accessible grouping systems, expansive boss guides, and a little bit more emphasis on trying the new content out prior to relying on a wiki or YouTube guide. Here's an anecdotal example. Well over half a year ago, I put myself through the ringer that is learning the Chambers of Xeric, specifically as a mage skipper at Ulm, which requires the most mechanical knowledge of the fight as compared to the other two roles in the pug. This process involved me joining a Discord, becoming verified, and trying to find a group of 2 other players that would take someone as inexperienced as me, and then be alright watching me plank on Ulm like fucking 15 times, god damn it. This doesn't help that Ulm is incredibly unintuitive and janky. The established methods of dealing with his mechanics are by and large emergent and unintended. Therefore, they rely on tells that are very difficult to see. It was by far the most frustrating experience I have ever had in old school RuneScape. Having 2 players rely on me to do my job is a kind of pressure that I enjoy in group content, but having that pressure stem from completely unintuitive design is infuriating. That, backed by the knowledge that my only access to this content was through a third-party application wherein I could accidentally develop a bad reputation as a shitty player who keeps fucking up the mage skip. Holy shit. Wasn't a great feeling. Ultimately, I learned how to mage skip, and then learned how to do solo cox too, but my god, it was the closest I have ever been to quitting this game, and part of the reason why I am so averse to stepping into the Inferno, for example. Spending 2 hours breaking pathing and hiding behind pillars is just not the kind of emergent mechanics that I am particularly interested in learning right now. I'll be a cheesecaper for at least a couple more months. Ulm and of course the Inferno are both undeniably deep and rewarding pieces of content, and I have come to appreciate how chill Cox can be once you understand it, but the methods of learning it are chock full of unneeded friction, especially in grouping, and I think Jagex can do a much better job at creating good grouping systems to promote people to actually do this content. Cross-world grouping, for example, the notice board should not be world-specific. And here's a hotter take. The notice board should be a UI element that you can access anywhere at any time, regardless of where you are in the game world. You should be able to apply to a Cox group while fishing anglers, because why the hell not? Far more group-focused MMOs like World of Warcraft have had this feature for years, and it works wonderfully. Creating teams for Mythic Plus is incredibly easy because of how intuitive and approachable it is. Anyway, back to democracy. The second step in my twofold suggestion is promotion. Push people to the polls. Vote. If we want polling to better represent a majority, then it should include all of those who won't find themselves interested in voting as well. I'm very much a voting absolutist, and I want polls to literally pop up as soon as you log in and not disappear until you make a choice. That's not to say you need to say yes or no. I think skipping a question is totally fine, but having that active choice creates an environment that will foster interest in more content down the line. If you are introduced to upcoming updates, you may be more interested in finding out what they offer rather than ignoring the booth altogether. Venturing to a bank and clicking on a booth isn't difficult, but it's also not an aspect of anyone's day-to-day gameplay. It's hard to make it a trend when polling is somewhat sporadic. It needs to be easier and more convenient because this is the stuff that determines the future of the game. On this topic, I wouldn't be against there being one poll a month to create a consistent trend in people's monthly engagement. For example, voting Fridays. At the end of every month, on the final Friday, Jagex introduces a couple poll questions. These polls don't have to be large, but they do need to be consistent. If people know that the final Friday of every month has a poll, then they will learn to expect it and might feel more keen on voting. And we don't need to have more game updates to facilitate this, just splitting apart some of those enormous polls that we occasionally get. There is also an argument to raise the overall level requirement for voting, and I suppose that is reasonable. I don't believe it should be raised too high. I think perhaps around 750 would be ideal, but I know some people truly want to gatekeep the very core of the game's health. Finally, we should all acknowledge that everyone in this space wants old school RuneScape to succeed and thrive. Sometimes their opinions may seem antithetical to that, but that is always and will always be the goal. Just acknowledging this lends enough good faith to the conversation that I think whatever hurdles come down the line, whether they be sailing or an entirely other new skill, they will always be more than surmountable. Why are there so many World of Warcraft players switching to old school RuneScape? You must have noticed them, right? Lurking around the Grand Exchange, trying to parse on a goblin, wondering where their ability bars are, and asking how Jagex is managing to update the game rather than re-releasing the same exact content over and over and over again. I sure did, because I'm one of those WoW players. A year and a half ago, after around half a month of MMO soul searching, I found old school RuneScape. I had quit WoW after Mythic raiding for around a decade for various reasons. I was sick of the short-form, seasonal ethos of the game, devaluing any and all of my progression, sick of the only valuable content being instanced, bored of the binary itemization and samey loot, and disheartened by Blizzard's complacency with the classic incarnation of the game. Clearly, I wasn't the only one. Mad Season, Guzu, Caradus, Savix, and more have since begun their first steps into this beloved, curated sandbox. What about RuneScape seems to have translated for the World of Warcraft player, and why? First, we must acknowledge where these WoW creators come from. Unlike myself, most of them are classic WoW players, an old-school 2004 incarnation of World of Warcraft, much like old-school RuneScape is of RuneScape. Unlike OSRS though, this version of World of Warcraft is following the timeline of WoW itself. Blizzard has been updating classic WoW every few months with new patches and eventually the very same expansions that released years ago. The initial release in 2018 is now entering the Mists of Pandaria expansion and resembles Retail WoW, the modern game, much more than it does Classic WoW or Vanilla WoW, the version from 2004. It's interesting to imagine a version of old school RuneScape that just kind of began releasing all the same updates, eventually ruining the game for the very same players that returned to it because it lacked those updates. Blizzard understood and saw this as the player base continued to shrink. Therefore, they opted for the seasonal servers that remixed the standard classic vanilla WoW experience. The Season of Mastery and eventually the Season of Discovery. These year-long servers run down the line of all the same patches that were released between 2004 and 2006 with some updates. The latter, Season of Discovery, or SOD, introduced runes and granted all kinds of player power in the form of new abilities and many old ones from future expansions, as well as reworked some of the raids and even added one new raid toward the end. It was an interesting experiment. Finally, Blizzard released the Classic Anniversary servers, so just Vanilla Classic, again, for a second, or some would argue, fourth time. That's the first point to take note of. These creators love WoW. Even I, to a certain extent, still do as well, especially Classic, a version of the game that I think is most tangibly an MMORPG. It's wonderful, yet regardless of your love for it, anything exceptional becomes dry over time, especially when not allowed to exist in our mind. Being fed the same thing, as great as it may be, over and over again doesn't foster a larger community, it pushes those sick of it away. And the amount becoming sick only increases in time. The repeated cycles of Classic aren't getting any fresher, and next time Blizzard relaunches Classic servers, chances are they'll see even less popularity. Similarly, Blizzard has floated the idea of a Classic Plus. This has been a long-running desire from the player base. Instead of re-releasing the same content, why not add truly new content to the game? In many ways, SOD was experimenting in that regard. Sadly, I'm a bit concerned with this. First, Blizzard's survey that introduced this idea was filled with nothing even remotely interesting systemically. It had a whole host of quality of life features such as account-wide collections and graphical improvements. Essentially, they were pitching retail WoW features alongside what Blizzard does most confidently: instanced content, new raids, dungeons, and so on. I suppose that's what people want, but I also think that this will kill the game down the line. You can add new skills, new classes, however, disregarding the architecture that makes most of these things function is an issue. It may work well for retail, but that's because the modern version of WoW is competitive and singular in its vision. It has an exceptional combat system that is the sole point of interaction with the rest of the game. By comparison, Classic WoW is emergent. It wouldn't be far-fetched to say that it is defined by its leveling experience more so than its end game. Because endgame in Classic WoW, the farming for pre-raid bis and then raid logging isn't the most evocative or unique feature. Leveling through the enormous uninstanced open world, forming groups to take down elites and brave difficult quests, finding ways to solo bosses, just running through the dense jungles and open plains. That is Classic WoW. The endgame is held together by emergent interactions never intended by the developers and seemingly never acknowledged since. The interpersonal relations of managing 40-odd raiders, the faction collusion, the war effort that saw, in my opinion, one of the best game series ever created around it. Even the collective flight paths to gather meticulously timed world buffs, these are the heartbeat of the game that aren't retained by just improving graphics, adding instanced player housing, and a new class. This survey saw Blizzard double down on things that are neat, I guess, but aren't what actually makes Classic WoW good. With all of that out of the way, we must also acknowledge the lull that Classic is currently in. The anniversary servers are chugging along with the 100-odd thousand players still logging weekly, Season of Discovery has ended, and the modern version of Classic WoW, Jesus Christ, there are so many versions, is entering an expansion that most original players aren't likely to return to. During this lull, people want something, and that something, for whatever reason, is old school RuneScape. RuneScape and WoW have a combative history with one another. I'm sure older players remember just how competitive and defensive these two groups were. The RuneScape versus World of Warcraft videos on the fledgling website known as YouTube were a not uncommon thing to see. The arguments at a lunch table, the friendships broken or lost, all of it laid a foundation for many experiences in the mid-2000s. And a singular truth was birthed from the din of childhood tribalism. World of Warcraft is better because it's for people whose parents are generous enough to front $15 a month for a subscription. Meanwhile, RuneScape is the kids' game for losers who can only get $5, or none bucks, stuck in the beleaguered free-to-play worlds like jobless middle school peasants. At that point, World of Warcraft was on top of the world. It was reaching its subscriber peak and growing. While RuneScape was undeniably a cultural force, it was always the lesser of the two. Times have kind of changed since then. World of Warcraft's popularity, while still at the top, has waned. The game has stagnated, failing to reach a new audience. Meanwhile, RuneScape has died and been rebirthed twice. Old school RuneScape has not only been growing, it has been thriving, especially in the past 2 years where the player count has almost doubled. This is thanks to exceptional updates focusing on the early and mid-game experience and external community-driven marketing from creators and Jagex alike. Leagues, the limited-time Season of Discovery-esque but way crazier game mode released in late 2024, saw more than 200,000 concurrent players, and now the game is reaching up those figures without the help of leagues at all. For reference, this is more concurrent players than the total individual raid logs in Classic WoW's Anniversary Edition every week. In July, we're seeing the release of the final part of the newest continent, Varlamore, and shortly after that, Old School's first entirely new skill, Sailing, which is expanding the world in ways never before seen in the game. Is that all it takes for the conversion for the WoW player to give it a go? Not entirely. OSRS offers certain similarities in experience that are worth mentioning, like the emphasis on emergent gameplay. Emergence is when unique, surprising interactions arise from engagement with standard systems in a video game. For example, in WoW Classic, it was the coordination between half a dozen guilds to time their world buff drops for the most amount of players to make sure there are no overlaps. These are methods of interaction never explicitly designed by the developers. They emerge thanks to player need and creativity. My favorite emergence system in Classic WoW was learning Dire Maul tribute runs on my Hunter all the way back in 2019. Not only was it a difficult solo challenge, but selling the loot and buffs to different players was a really cool way to earn money. These things don't exist in retail WoW. The game has been meticulously designed to be balanced and competitive. Therefore, any outliers such as this are immediately patched out. There's even a refrain popularized by players calling out this behavior. Fun detected, they say in unison as Blizzard removes an emergent mechanic that may trivialize something. In OSRS, this happens less. The line between exploit and emergence is thinner. It is also encouraged with the existence of the wilderness, a zone where PvP is enabled and upon dying, you drop your loot. If you are not the aggressor or unskulled, you retain 3 of your most expensive items, and if you are skulled, the aggressor, you lose everything. There is a tangible risk-reward in the wilderness that makes it unlike anything else in theme park MMOs. It has singles areas for one-on-ones and multi-combat zones for group fights, fostering a truly sprawling and occasionally terrifying environment. It has its issues, but is ultimately a totally unique element of RuneScape. The open-world PvP during Classic WoW's heyday was kind of similar to this. If you decided to play on a PvP server, it wasn't uncommon to run into roving warbands of bloodthirsty players farming honor points on random people. It created a hide-and-seek leveling experience that definitely got tiresome, but was pretty crazy nonetheless. This system is only begotten to wilderness in old school, so it's a bit more manageable there. Of course, in PvP, death is nowhere near as punishing in WoW as you only lose time, but the general ethos of open PvP is worth considering as a point of interest. OSRS has emergence that extends far past PvP too. It wouldn't be far-fetched to suggest that the vast majority of PvE bosses in RuneScape have emergent mechanics defining them, whether it be safe spotting Dagannoth Kings, butterflying Akka, soloing Cox, and anything in between. Even the skilling in OSRS is often thought of as an emergent experience thanks to tick manipulation being a valid method for a lot of players. It also has an effective blend of communality and solo expression. Some of the most difficult content in OSRS is solo. However, the experience of playing the game itself is a lot more communal. Not in the sense that it demands grouping, that's not the only method of multiplayer communality, just being around others is enough. Because the game isn't linear in its progression, it's a sandbox. No zone is ever out-leveled or outright devalued. You are just as likely to see high-level players in Varrock, the second city most players go to, as you are in the elven city of Prifdinas. Mario. Not only does this make the game feel more alive, it also creates the emergent experience of seeing someone, as soon as you zone in, wearing way cooler shit than you are, and giving you something to aspire to as a result. This is of course dead in retail WoW thanks to the overabundance of cosmetic overrides applying inane visuals to anyone, anywhere, making it impossible to tell if someone is a badass because they cleared a mythic raid or just swiped their credit card or farmed an old piece of content while watching YouTube videos on another monitor. Classic WoW, at least the original version, didn't have cosmetic overrides, so being able to actually see what someone is wearing lent a credible aura of authenticity to the game world and its player base. Everything felt of that world, and the items being worn gained an aesthetic value. They were recognized. The legendary armaments were legendary. That has since faded in time thanks to the repeated launches and eventual mastery of all the content, but it did exist at one point. Because it's persistently updated, OSRS never lost that, and while certain gear may be less impressive today than it was in 2015 or 2005, new gear has taken its place. Seeing someone in Sanguine Torva or the newly released Radiant Oathplate armor, especially if they achieve these things on an Iron Man, is incredibly impressive. Just having that communally recognized value promotes more people to seek that recognition. After all, flexing your hard-earned achievements is a core part of existing alongside other people, whether it be in-game or not. World of Warcraft, at least right now, is failing to offer a permanent home for its players, asking them time and time again to recreate the same characters and re-experience the same events.
Bro, I wish Classic WoW Hardcore had these challenges. Goodness gracious, man.
Yeah, that's not
These
bad.
are so
That's the
cool.
last bat wave. I have a decent amount of prayer.
This is exactly what I've been
56
asking
also
for
had a
forever.
bit of a sketchy lore, but not one that I haven't done before.
It's funny, I criticize retail WoW for becoming a fleeting, seasonal experience that devalues everything you've earned every new patch, but Classic WoW has become that too. With every new incarnation, it resets everyone back to zero and asks them to run that treadmill again. Blizzard is plagued by the disease of seasonality. They seem incapable of creating anything outside of that paradigm because it is the only way to foster continuous engagement in their eyes. Perhaps that's more a fault of the theme park MMO than it is of their own creativity. The Season of Discovery, being seasonal in name, also operated this way. It had incremental level gates, 20, 30, 40, and so on, that acted like miniature expansion releases with a new raid, some new content, and new abilities and other stuff. Blizzard, being tied to this seasonal model, was terrified of making players feel like they need to catch up to their friends, so they caught up for them. Level boosts, experience boosts, and so on. It became so disconnected conceptually from the original classic, the original vanilla, the experience people originally connected with, that it asked them to skip it entirely. Expediting the leveling in classic is like offering maraschino cherries as the dessert itself. It's like the rosemary being garnished by the steak. It makes absolutely no sense and caters to a demographic of players that exist antithetically to an MMO. The genre is defined by persistent engagement, a world that continues living, but by promoting momentary engagement for incredibly short periods of time, you create artificial bursts of popularity and then long lulls where most prospect players don't want to join, because it looks dead. But here we are today. Players clearly want some kind of emergent experience in a growing game. One of my favorite examples of this was actually in Classic WoW's anniversary servers released only a little while ago. OnlyFans, a content creator-driven guild conceptualized by streamer Sodapoppin. It was a communal experiment, a creator house like you'd see back in 2016, but done in World of Warcraft. It was a persistently running reality television show that tested the mental fortitude of all those involved, because OnlyFans was less so about the game and more so about people interacting with one another through the game.
Look at that speed! Oh my god! Holy shit! No, P-Bob, you've gotten every single item!
Yeah, I've got one item.
It's gotten, and it's good for Warrior! You've gotten every item, bro!
Listen. I'll pass if you come to my stream and rate my physique.
Wait, what?
Alright,
Holy you're shredded, bro! What the
Was not
Wait, is that a bodysuit? Wait, this
Wait,
guy
you're
is
massive.
shredded, by the way!
Wait, it's actually huge.
What's your body fat percentage?
I followed Tyler 1's journey through the guild's rise and eventual dissolution. Tyler 1 is, of course, another streamer, popular for his abrasive and somewhat controversial personality and exceptional League of Legends play. Never having played Classic WoW before, he ventured into OnlyFans with an open mind. OnlyFans was created on the hardcore server, meaning that if you die, you lose your character, and simultaneously, the guild ran alongside a host of add-ons, or in RuneScape terminology, plugins, that created race-driven competitions. Undead, Tauren, Orcs, and Trolls all competed against one another through this external system. There were raffles, battles, arguments, and everything in between. During this process, I watched Tyler 1 learn the game, go from meandering around, keyboard turning, and sometimes forgetting to attack, to running a 40-man raid. His interaction with different content creators, his fabricated drama with Sodapoppin, his insistence to essentially roleplay a rise to power, narrativized the entire experience. It did so well that when he died, it became a legendary moment within the community. While leading a raid into Molten Core, battling the fire elemental Baron Geddon, Tyler 1 was faced with a decision. Go for the kill, DPSing down the final few percent and healing through the AoE explosions, or play it safe, run away. His fatal call was to DPS, go full hog as they say, Zug the Zuggler, full send, and his shouts echoed through the voice call, unaware that many had already begun to run. Because when a death means a reset of your progress, it's every man for himself.
back in. Everybody back in. Everybody back in. I'm death wishing. Big heals. Big heals on me. Big heals on me. I'm death wishing. Big heals on me.
Holy shit.
Let the bomb. Big heals on me. Big heals on me. You can't listen. Finish it. Don't run. Finish. Finish. Don't run. Finish. Finish.
Oh my god!
GG. We're all dead.
The boss fell, but not without the death of many of those brave enough to fight alongside their war chief in his final moments. This felt like the end of the story, and for many it was. It was facilitated by Classic WoW, by the hardcore servers, by the raid itself, but this existed only due to the emergent methods through which these creators decided to approach this re-release. Why do I bring this up though? For an OSRS player, it may be obvious. This happens all the fucking time in RuneScape. Not on the same scale as OnlyFans and Sodapoppin's achievement of managing to wrangle in the egos of dozens if not hundreds of content creators for months was unlike anything I've ever seen, but in a microcosm, this is RuneScape's most common creator-driven element. The best comparison is Deadman All-Stars, wherein a large OSRS content creator, Solo Mission, teamed up with Jagex by obtaining a custom server wherein 35 of the largest content creators in the game created teams of 5 in a full PvP version of the game. Almost every area became dangerous. In these servers, all 35 creators had expedited experience rates and drops, and a bit over a week of time to gear up for the finale. A King of the Hill style one-on-one deathmatch where they, donning the gear they've collected, were put to the test against one another. The 10-day period that this event spanned was amongst the most fun in the game's history, as following the individual and group-wide achievements and battles became so many people's day-to-day habit. The battles fought, the gear lost, the upsets, the strategies, the drama, it felt like a condensed version of OnlyFans buoyed by each creator's personality, loudest of which was Odablock. Odablock is the largest old-school RuneScape streamer. He, much like Tyler1, is an abrasive, controversial figure with a huge fanbase. He's also one of the best PvPers in the entire game. He was the captain for the Odablock Warriors, and throughout this event, they became, in some ways, the focal point, the core narrative. In the draft, Odablock recruited what was considered to be the strongest set of PvPers. They were the only ones capable of defeating the Solo Mission Snakes, a team labeled as this season's villains. This was because they had a rather toxic player that received a yellow card for potentially stream sniping. This was made worse by this player's previous history of less than honorable behavior, to put it simply. On top of this, many felt as though the Snakes didn't have a particularly fun way of playing, as they locked down a specific area of the game and farmed it, all the while taking on group fights to snowball their growing advantage. On the day of the finale, tensions were high. Odablock broke over 100,000 concurrent viewers, and simultaneously the old school and RuneScape streams had a collective concurrent viewership of over 150,000. To say that this event gained traction would be an understatement. As the Warriors began their first fight, it wasn't looking good. Good players fell early, and in this King of the Hill style system, the person who defeated the other remained in battle, granting the opposing team the ability to snowball an advantage. The cards did not look to be in the Warriors' favor, but Odablock himself hadn't yet stepped in the ring. As the bell rung and his character moved in, he disconnected. His entire home was DDoSed, and the competition, for a brief moment, was put on hold.
Of the Warriors, what can he do to claw this fight back?
Come on, you are Odablock. Play like Odablock.
No, I think this is actually a tactical decision with
Really?
his sigils. Yeah, he's got the sigil of the
Interesting.
meticulous maid, so he's got that extra 40 accuracy bonus, so he can afford to sit in this tanky Verak skirt for some of the freezes.
That's
when
me
he
told.
knows.
Was it like instantly or after a little bit?
So somebody did ask me, bro. It has to be because I didn't even start yet. I didn't even start yet. As soon as I crossed the border, I DC'd. Wow, that's so fucking cringe. I don't know what to do. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know what to do. Because the phone, the hotspot, you just can't. It can't hold it. It can't hold.
Are you able to change house? People are spamming. I'm not sure if that's viable. Like, how long would it take you if that could happen? How long would that take you?
I could try it. Yeah, maybe like 5 minutes. I could just run to a different house.
He rushed over to a friend's home, mouse and keyboard in hand, in an effort to continue the fight. However, it just wasn't the same. It is one thing to play on a friend's setup, and that alone doesn't feel great. But to do so in such a high-stakes, high-skill competition, it's borderline impossible. While he performed admirably, his misclicks were noticeable. The precision needed to play old-school RuneScape well is beyond any other MMO, so even a small change in setup create massive gaps in performance. Ultimately, the Warriors performed well, but they did not win. Their matches were the most watched, and in many ways, after their elimination, that story concluded. I bring up these two somewhat similar examples to showcase an overlap, a way to engage with the game that sometimes doesn't put the game first. This engagement uses it to uplift something else entirely, a community-driven event, a creator-designed story, a personally aspired to goal. The overlap between old-school RuneScape and WoW Classic isn't systemic. These games aren't similar. As Sodapoppin said while watching some OSRS videos, RuneScape is the bane for WoW players. It utilizes an entirely different skill set that doesn't translate. You'd think that would be a point of aversion, yet it isn't, because the point of connection is far more important for a lot of people. WoW players might be looking for something more permanent as they currently linger in the seasonal lull, a period between when their progress finished and when they must start it all again. A point of reflection that surely has some ask, why do I want to do it all again? To summarize, the lull that World of Warcraft is in currently, as every version of the game is between releases, has made its most prolific content creators branch out. This may not be a permanent investment, but it surely is interesting to see. These two old titans of the industry are still rubbing shoulders, but the balance of power might have started to change. If there's ever a time to visit old school RuneScape, it's now, on the cusp of its largest update. The benefit of it being a curated sandbox is that each edition is additive. The game has only become larger with time. It doesn't cannibalize itself with seasonal content. That alone could be something interesting to players that have become so accustomed to being cannibalized. I was one of them, after all, tired of spending months earning what became cosmetic overrides devalued by a glut of cosmetic overrides. WoW felt like it was shrinking, not in player base per se, but as a world. With every addition, with every update, the amount of land expands, but the relevant content only inhabits a smaller and smaller fraction of it. It was refreshing to step into a world as persistent as my kitchen and the roof over my head. The long-form nature of old-school RuneScape's progression incentivized me to pursue the grind, rather than recoil from it, because I knew that every time I inched closer to my goal, that goal wouldn't leap ahead by miles every half year. It would remain, and a new goal would be added somewhere between or somewhere after. Retail doesn't offer a home, even when the developers are hard at work on the player-owned housing system, because retail is as acommunal as possible. There is almost no emergence within its body because the intent of the game has disconnected entirely from its roots as an MMORPG. There is no core leveling experience, no overworld organization, no coordination needed for anything that isn't small group instanced content. It's a game split down the middle, a single-player lonely adventure through a barren overworld, flitting between checklist slop and the next instance dungeon, and the instance dungeon itself. For those that love this about retail, the ability to hop into a game and in a weekend find yourself caught up to everyone else, that's perfect, and likely why most would feel alienated by RuneScape. On the other hand, Classic WoW offers a bountiful leveling experience. The heights of OnlyFangs were never the raids, they were the journey to get to them. The leveling of Classic is, for those who do it, amongst the best gaming experiences because it effortlessly mixes flow state calm with heart-pumping danger, especially on hardcore servers. Old School RuneScape is something different. It is a game on a separate path. Matt Season is a Classic WoW content creator who has cataloged his journey into Old School RuneScape without guides, and for those who have watched his videos have surely seen, Matt Season is pulling from game knowledge outside of his classic World of Warcraft pool because the skill set he obtained through WoW has not translated. But the appeal of slowly, often arduously moving through the world and becoming lost in the maze of systems and incomprehensible functions has evoked feelings that leveling in Classic once did. Not today, when leveling has become expected and understood, but back then, before the re-release, when every step felt fresh.
I'm obsessed with the history of RuneScape. I've spent thousands of hours researching dusty archives and old forum posts in order to tell a story that no one's told all at once before. The history of RuneScape's world map. This video details an exhaustive list of every update from late 2002 all the way to the end of what we today call RuneScape Classic. I promise that if you've ever crossed paths with RuneScape before, this video will be filled with nostalgic memories and the fascinating past of how the RuneScape world was built, chunk by chunk. If you're interested in this kind of thing, then this channel is for you, and I've got other videos that you'll also love. But for today's story, let's talk about something that can't be argued. RuneScape has one of the most famous tutorials in all of gaming, but it wasn't always like that. The game didn't even have a real tutorial for the first 2 years. In the first version of the tutorial, it wasn't exactly the same iconic tutorial island that you may remember. So if you had logged into RuneScape in those early days, you had to be ready to get thrown to the wolves. And by wolves, of course, I mean the Highwayman, the Dark Wizard south of Varrock, player killers, and, well, yes, the literal wolves on White Wolf Mountain as well. But the biggest and baddest wolf of them all during all of RuneScape Classic was none other than the King Black Dragon. And would you believe it if I told you that the KBD was released on the very same day as Tutorial Island? So before Tutorial Island became the player's virtual school and Brenna taught us how to chop trees, light fires, and catch shrimp, you instead had to learn how to play RuneScape alone at the School of Hard Knocks. Or if you were lucky, you may have experienced a homemade tutorial from your schoolmates, from your brother's friend, or from that weird kid in the school library who also played the game. Their tutorial of the game was quite a bit different from the real one, and featured such impossible tasks as how to use shears and dye on a chef's hat to make your own party hat, how to buy a girlfriend for the low price of 10k GP, how to duplicate your best item by dropping it and then pressing Alt and F4, how to claim random buildings as your own to roleplay the cancelled player-owned housing developments. And who could forget, how to detect an attempt to lure you into the wilderness so you don't get PK'd and lose all of your items. Wait, that last one is actually from the real tutorial? Even if you're a seasoned veteran of the game who remembers the original tutorial island, I guarantee you'll be shocked by some of the other oddities from the early days of RuneScape. I've spent thousands of hours putting together the timeline that tells a totally different story about the history of the game from a perspective that you've never heard before. So strap in and let me tell you all about it. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss any of the surprises in store today. September 24th, 2002. North American audiences were captivated by American Idol, Spirited Away, Kingdom Hearts, Animal Crossing, and most importantly,
Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome.
Friends won a couple of Emmy Awards on this date, But if you didn't have an apartment full of friends to teach you how to play RuneScape before work or after school, that's okay, because Brenna and Vanica were the only friends you really needed. It's just too bad that Vanica gives us a bronze sword instead of one of those keyblades from Kingdom Hearts. You know, the sword that's actually a key, but when you stick it in someone, it unlocks their death. So the original tutorial island here was mostly the same one that we know and love from RuneScape 2. However, what's interesting is that in Classic, Tutorial Island actually had a special section that we didn't have in RuneScape 2 or any version of the game today. There really was a whole section dedicated to learning about both the brutal risks and great rewards of the wilderness. They probably shouldn't have removed this section of the tutorial as a requirement for graduation because there are still players today who don't seem to understand this concept. I'm sure they removed it because it scared too many new players away, but without it, some players now feel entitled to the rewards that the wilderness has to offer, but at the same time think they should also be exempt from the associated risks. Despite what you may hear on Reddit, you just simply cannot separate the risks from the rewards. As a result, many players who made their first visit to Tutorial Island after 2003 genuinely just don't seem to understand that the wilderness really is a dangerous place and just blindly wander in. They literally had to add a ditch to the wilderness in 2007 to stop players from unintentionally bringing valuables into the wilderness. If you want to find players intentionally bringing valuables into the wilderness, look no further than the players who now hunt the endgame boss of RuneScape Classic that was also released on this same date, the King Black Dragon. The KBD would remain the toughest boss in game for at least a couple of years, well into RuneScape 2. The most efficient way to kill him was to bring some friends to tap in and out as needed. While waiting for their turn to melee, they could also range him, even though multi-combat didn't technically exist yet. Regardless, taking turns also allowed players ample time to heal from damage taken in an effort to evenly spread the boss's damage around. This was no easy fight, even with a team, but the rewards of the elusive Dragon Medhelm and a pretty good chance at the rare piece of the Dragon Square Shield made it all worth it for those best-in-slot upgrades that we covered in another video. It's just ironic that the endgame boss of Classic was released on the very same day as the tutorial. Perhaps releasing these two updates together is what inspired Jagex from 2008 to 2011 to remove Tutorial Island and replace it with some flawed and ineffective tutorials called Learning the Ropes and Unstable Foundations that both involved slaying a dragon. You know, that thing you're not supposed to do until you've completed the free-to-play version of the game. In total, Jagex tried 5 failed alternative tutorials over the course of a decade in RuneScape 3, but ultimately settled on a return to a revamped Tutorial Island. One more life lesson after leaving Tutorial Island here in 2002 was to not trust your mates to actually split the D-Med helm drop, supposedly promising to pay you back in monthly installments while they paraded around the whole map wearing your glorious prize, claiming to be earning the necessary GP for your split. Fortunately, we knew just who to call to get our money now after being unable to avoid this jingle while just trying to watch TV over summer break that year. Now, this day saw one last change to the map as well, with the addition of Backstorian Falls, the waterfall north of Artie that was, as the name would imply, released alongside the Waterfall quest. You know, that one quest that everyone does at the start of a new member's account today to immediately jump 30 levels in attack and strength right away. Well, that trick didn't exactly work back then. In fact, what if I told you that no quest XP rewards were ever originally meant to allow players to just skip the early game all the way from level 1 to level 30? The reality is that quest XP rewards in Classic actually scaled with your level. Completing Waterfall quest at level 1 attack would immediately boost you a whopping 4 levels up to level 5. Good enough to equip steel weapons, but not good enough for adamant like today. At best, you could jump up to 8 levels from level 12 to level 20 to equip mithril weapons. At level 60, we reach an equilibrium of sorts between the two game engines. The formula for the XP reward at level 60 in Classic equals the flat XP reward in RuneScape 2 and Old School RuneScape. Does this imply that during the transition from Classic to RuneScape 2, that Jagex believed that this quest should be completed by those who already have level 60 attack and strength? Because I don't think it was their intention for brand new level 3 accounts to complete this quest and skip 30 levels of progression. Check out some of these other iconic quests and see what level Jagex assumed you already had prior to completion based on each quest's XP reward formula. I actually think that despite Rendy's best efforts to prove them wrong today, most of these were actually pretty reasonable assumptions for the average contemporary player based on the game engine in RuneScape Classic in 2002, but they really just didn't translate to RuneScape 2's game engine. The quests were just a lot easier in the RuneScape 2 engine. It's yet another example of one of those odd relics carried forward from Classic that could have been corrected in March of 2004 with the release of RuneScape 2, but ultimately wasn't. Lastly on this date, we saw the release of the first of the God Letters, the early precursor to Posty Pete's Post Bag from the Hedge, where Andrew Gower would offer in-universe responses to fan mail from the perspective of the gods. In these letters, we learned all of the following, among much more. Peers are an abomination. The Alcarid kebab shop uses goblin meat rather than camel meat. Damrak is a Chad and ladies' man who goes commando. Even the gods know of Thurgo's ravenous and insatiable appetite for red berry pie. And the lake south of Taverley is filled with raw sewage from Falador. Someone should probably tell that to that one druid doing laundry there. October 23rd, 2002. Just 3 days after the revival of Top Gear, featuring Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond, James May, and The Stig, the renewal of a beloved British television program that was now even bigger. But don't you dare try to watch in the UK without a telly license, or the BBC Bobbies will start knocking on your door with vigor. This is also the date in RuneScape when we were first called Wana, which, as we all know, directly translates to new friend. The first thing you probably notice with this map update is all of these new icons that appear everywhere. Those represent beds that players could now sleep in, or rather, had to sleep in. Some of them were already in the game, such as upstairs in the house I claimed as my own, north of Falador Park, the same house that eventually moved south of the park with the spade spawn, and an estate agent squatter. In hindsight, I should have never trusted him with the key to sell the place after I moved to Remington 19 years ago. I figured he was trustworthy because he sponsored the Falador Park Homeowners Association resident directory, and his contact info was all there on the back page. I should have been more suspicious when he claimed his name was just estate agent, but alas. Even more strange than that guy, these beds also popped up in some really odd and remote places. According to one of those upcoming God Letters we just mentioned, there originally were no beds in the wilderness, which made training there practically impossible. But they did eventually add some there. The Sapphire spawn on the Spider Hill just south of the Deep Wilderness fence was once found in a house with a bed. Moss Giant Island northwest of Brimhaven wouldn't release until the next map update, but also randomly contained some cake in a bed. Even the building that would eventually merge with the Deep Wilderness dungeon stairs randomly had a bed. Why were those beds actually shoehorned in seemingly randomly all across the map? You see, there used to be a fatigue system, or fatigue as I used to pronounce it until my parents overheard me and correctly taught me how to pronounce this fancy new word. In Classic, having a full inventory wouldn't stop you from continuing to mine or woodcut or fish. However, after this update, almost every XP generating action in game was now assigned a certain fatigue value, and once you hit 100% fatigue, you would stop gaining experience altogether. The only way to reset it was to go to sleep in either a bed or eventually a portable sleeping bag upon their release 7 months later in May 2003, even though Jagex never even wanted to release them in the first place. Imagine if we had this fatigue system in old school RuneScape today, and you went to redeem the cooking XP from a bunch of wines or combat XP from pest control, and you just got nothing because you forgot you were already at 100% fatigue. If it were one of those 200 mil cooking XP at once accounts live streaming their 1 million unfermented jugs of wine, then the rage from that moment would be historic. But the community roasting of that player would be even more historic, probably being memed for decades to come. We would probably even be reminiscing about it in the retirement home in the 2070s. Now, while asleep, you would have had to enter a prehistoric CAPTCHA. Sometimes the CAPTCHAs were cute. Sometimes they were cheeky, nerdy, dirty, or accusatory. Sometimes the Brits at Jagex would confess their own ancestral guilt. Sometimes Jagex would show us their greatest desires, or tell us about future updates. And sometimes they would clairvoyantly tell us what we would receive in lieu of a bonus at work 23 years in the future. Although these would be easily solvable by a modern bot, any of those would seem almost refreshing for a real human today, instead of trying to teach some self-driving car's crappy AI the difference between a traffic light and a bus. As previously mentioned, prior to this update, you could just keep skilling forever, like one of those early skilling relics during leagues. Even with a full inventory, you could keep mining or fishing or woodcutting to your heart's content, with all of the extra resources automatically falling onto the floor without having to manually drop them. Power training with iron ore, teak logs, or barbarian fishing in old school RuneScape today wouldn't be so bad if we still had this. In fact, this was a pretty significant training method in Classic. That Dragoon guy, who was debatably the first to 99 firemaking, did so by following around the top woodcutter at the time and lighting all of the automatically dropped logs from them. The trade-off compared to today is that you had to manually click for every attempt at gathering a resource back then, whereas in RuneScape 2 or Old School, your character would keep trying automatically until successful, but you had to manually empty your inventory when it got full. However, this was obviously no concern for the bot plague, hence the introduction of the fatigue system to slow them down. Speaking of plagues, we also saw another installment of the Plague quest line with the Biohazard quest. By far and away, the most mentioned quest in the God Letters for some reason. Andrew Gower must have been particularly proud of this quest because he kept finding ways to shoehorn it into responses to unrelated letters. Speaking of pride, Biohazard is also the quest where Elena confesses her feelings for your character on the very same day that beds were introduced to the game. Coincidence? It is interesting how progressive the real dialogue here was in 2002. Elena would profess her love for your character, whether you were the Old Knight or Blue Rose 13X, canonically making Elena the first established LGBT character in RuneScape over 20 years ago. What's even more interesting is that the player base back then wasn't soft like it is today, so no one was really bothered by this. There were no riots about this, no whiny forum posts, no meme spammers on Reddit celebrating it, and definitely no tantrums from the mouth-breathing ogres on Twitter claiming, "This is political," or "Stop breaking my immersion," or "Stake to RuneScape," or any one of their other iconic fake excuses they used to harass Mod Ash and his colleagues on there. How fitting, though, that these very same ogres also saw the release of their ancestral homeland of Feldip Hills on this date too. But we also had a lot of other real estate added on this day as well. The most notable other entries to our list had to be Luwanai and Yanil. You know, that place where Josh isn't gaming is, in fact, gaming. I don't care what he says or how pleasant his homemade music is, that man is a fraud. He claims he isn't gaming, but clearly he is. Why won't he just admit it? Anyway, as you can see, Jagex was clearly continuing their southward and westward pushes into both Kandarin and Karamja. Furthermore, it would also make more sense if the impassable mountain terrain of the Galarpos Mountains was released with this update rather than the next one. But it's difficult to say for sure since the 3 official wikis show 3 different release dates. Regardless, while the game saw a lot of new real estate in October, it would be nearly 2 months before we would see another major update to the game. Fortunately, we saw a gauntlet of releases of iconic movies and other games to occupy our time and attention in the meantime, one of which featured Eminem, who is now a grandfather. Feel old yet? A small selection of familiar titles might be Vice City, Metroid Prime, Cubivore, Ratchet & Clank, 8 Mile, Chamber of Secrets, 28 Days Later, and Die Another Day. You know, the title of that Bond film would suggest that there would be a better day to die than that one, but just when exactly was this best day to die? December 12th, 2002, the release of the Agility skill. The game saw yet another massive map expansion alongside the release of the new skill. Just like Karamja being the fishing expansion, Haverly being the herblore expansion, Deer's Village being the fletching expansion, and Ardone being the thieving expansion, the Gnome Stronghold now served as not only the Agility map expansion, but also far more importantly, as the home of the iconic Gnome Child, famously recognized by scapers and non-scapers alike for his adoration of only the dankest of memes. Within the Gnome Stronghold was, of course, the Gnome Agility course, and soon also the Gnome Ball Field in January, as RuneScape's second ever minigame. We also received the Barbarian Agility course and Yanil Agility Dungeon as well. The Agility Dungeon was also a hotspot for herblore training as well, with the release of a new mini-boss many of you have probably never even heard of, called Solaren the Twisted. He can only be defeated using strike spells with mind runes. Even if some nerd showed up in max mage with Tumikin Shadow, or max range with a twisted bow, or max melee with a rune 3-handed sword, they would still just splash or miss every time. Meanwhile, a fresh Iron Man account, fire striking everything in sight, can just walk up and get the KO, assuming they have the agility or thieving level to make it this far. Once finally slain, he sometimes drops Sinister Keys, which are aptly used to unlock the Sinister Chest, which contains a fixed and consistent assortment of herbs, the only way at the time of obtaining the brand new Torstal herb. These new herbs could be used to make brand new Zami brews, but they also required Jangerberries, which were also newly released on this day, and these could only be found west of Yanil amongst the ogres. The map also shrank from a certain point of view with the new agility shortcuts to make it a bit quicker to get around the ever-expanding world map, as well as some new areas that could only be accessed by those as nimble as Cat on a hot tin roof. One such area was the brand new Moss Giant Island via the rope swing to get there, requiring a whopping level 10 agility. Your character even does a little bit of a Tarzan scream while swinging across the rope. This update also began the Monkey Quest line with the release of the Grand Tree Quest and infamous villain Gloff, the evil gnome who thought The Amazing Race was a television show about his fellow gnomes, but plotted to destroy humans when he found out the show was really about PC gamers. With that quest, we also saw a second small expansion to Karamja with the Shipyard. Another one of those mostly useless places that probably could have just been an instance, barely worth even mentioning here. Let's go back to the Grand Tree for just a moment. A lot of players have false memories of the Gnome Restaurant minigame being released in 2006. However, it was actually the first ever minigame in all of RuneScape much earlier than that. The 2006 update was just a rework, so the wiki actually gets this release date wrong, as evidenced by the introduction of gnome foods like Toad Crunchies and Chocolate Bombs. In the original version of the Gnome Restaurant, all orders would be delivered to a Luft Jian, rather than to gnomes within the Gnome Stronghold or all around the world. It's just that no one really participated in this minigame because there weren't really any rewards, and the cooking XP involved was negligible at best. We've all worked jobs like that in real life we'd rather forget, where we got almost no pay and no valuable experience, so I can understand why players subconsciously wanted to suppress this memory as well. Speaking of terrible jobs, the gnomes of the Gnome Stronghold weren't the only source of high fantasy released this month, as just 2 weeks later, only a few days before the end of the year, the world would also see the founding of LinkedIn. This one is by far and away the worst and fakest of all the social media apps, where so-called professionals with delusions of adequacy network with their current and former work peers and greatly exaggerate their skills and experience. Somehow, it would be far sadder and even more pathetic if these works of fiction actually happened. And you know, if such a website somehow existed within RuneScape, that these gnome restaurant workers would all be claiming to be a master chef, mixologist, and executive delivery boy offering customized white glove client experiences while delicately handling transactions for a multi-million GP corporation. Nah bro, you just worked the Sunday of the Gnome Ball Championship one time while putting yourself through Tutorial Island, and now you think you deserve a free pass to an internship at the Dwarven Consortium in Keldagrim, exchanging commodities? Bro needs a serious reality check. January 27th, 2003. Somebody had to put these delusional employees in their place, and who better than Terry Tate, office linebacker.
You know you need a cover sheet on your TPS reports, Richard!
It was announced during the previous day's Super Bowl that Terry and others like him would be joining American workplaces everywhere to increase productivity by taking down common office nuisances like HR.
Never be penetrated without HR approval.
This was exactly the type of farm system or development squad needed for the country to win its 37th Super Bowl in a row. In fact, that record is still active over 20 years later. Is the rest of the world even trying? Well, no, not exactly, I guess, but at least the country that invented the sport is actually winning it, unlike the Stanley Cup for the last 30 years, or the World Cup for the last 60 years. Like, imagine if the Gnome Stronghold and Gnome Village started losing the Gnome Ball Championship to Shiloh Village or Brimhaven every year. It would just be pathetic. Speaking of Karamja, the world saw an expansion further south into the island with the release of Shiloh Village and the similarly named quest, but the villagers were perhaps a little too focused on fending off an army of the undead to surpass the gnomes at Gnome Ball. But much like in Gnome Ball, they wanted to win and survive this zombie apocalypse. They were going to need a plan of action from a seasoned professional. So here's the plan for Shiloh Village quest. Okay, we take Hajiti's cart, arrive in Shiloh Village, go in, kill the one small favor guy, sorry Yanni, grab the steel key ring with the bone key, go to Queen Rashelia's tomb, tell her to piss off, retreat to MacGruber's wood to trap her army of the dead in a place no human will ever venture, head to Brother Galahad's, pull up, have a cup of tea, and wait for this whole thing to blow over. No. That wouldn't be safe. There's a top secret section of broken fence they could potentially escape from and infect all of Kandarin. Okay, take the cart, arrive in Shiloh Village, kill the one small favor guy, sorry, grab the keys, go to Queen Rashelia's tomb, tell her to piss off, lure her army of the dead to Shiloh Village, go to the dead man's chest in Brimhaven, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all of this to blow over. No, I guess we can't sacrifice all of Shiloh Village like that. Okay, we gather some items and information from around the island, we head over to Queen Rashelia's tomb, take care of Nazastrul, we go over to her son's tomb, bury them together to bring her spirit to peace, return to Shiloh Village, and kill the one small favor guy anyway, just in case he was the last remaining zombie. How's that for a slice of fried gold? Now, speaking of certified gold and platinum, January 28th, 2003. Amy Lee of Evanescence had just personally asked each and every single one of us to wake her up inside. You know, Mike Shinoda from Linkin Park actually declined the opportunity to perform the rap feat in the middle of the song. Maybe if he had done it, we wouldn't have been too embarrassed to admit that, let's just be honest, we're all among friends here. We all secretly enjoyed that song. Unfortunately, Jagex didn't get the memo because they were clearly asleep at the wheel on this date, and they didn't ask any of us for a wake-up call. This map update finally saw the release of Gnome Ball, but more importantly, saw the release of the Wilderness Agility Arena for much better XP rates for high-level players. This continues our theme of high risk, high reward, and Wait, you mean you could just get broken XP rates here without any risk? How does that make any sense? The whole philosophy of the Wilderness had been fairly consistent up until this point. High risk, high reward. Now players had no incentive to risk anything here for top agility XP rates, and because of there being no risk, there was no incentive for PKers to hunt here other than griefing. Jagex actually wouldn't fix this mistake until 21 and a half years later in Old School. Also of note is the date of release. This update was literally the very next day after the Shiloh Village update. No, it's not a mistake. We just got multiple major content updates in the same week. We're lucky if we get 2 updates of this magnitude in a single quarter of the year today, let alone twice in the same week. However, you'll probably notice the updates really start to slow down for the rest of the year and eventually stop altogether, as Jagex was mainly focused on the entire game in 3D for RuneScape 2's launch. March 3rd, 2003. Just a week and a half after American pop singer Olivia Rodrigo was born, Jagex took us to an even darker place than she did with her first album, Sour, with the release of the Underground Pass. This is one of those regions of the map that, even today in Old School, still somehow looks straight out of Classic. This is going to be a recurring theme this year because Jagex was concurrently releasing updates for most of 2003 while also immediately remaking them for re-release in early 2004 upon the launch of RuneScape 2. As such, a lot of the 2003 and even some of the late 2002 updates, even still today, feel so much older than some updates released far earlier on. That's why I love visiting clunky places like Shiloh Village and the Legends Quest dungeon, because they still have that nostalgic feel, and I hope they leave them alone forever for that reason. Now, we've already talked about this quest and area quite a few times on this channel, so as a brief summary for the uninitiated, this cavern below the impassable mountain terrain, known as the Galarpos Mountains, acts as a dangerous below-ground mountain pass filled with all sorts of dangers like booby traps, monsters, and seemingly impossible agility obstacles. During the appropriately named Underground Pass quest, we had to make our way from the entrance in West Ardone all the way to the very back, which would one day lead us to the then unreleased Elflands via the Well of Voyage. The most memorable and most frustrating part of this quest was probably constantly failing the agility obstacles many miles away from a bank to restock on food and other crucial supplies. So, while this wasn't an update to the surface of the map, the many miles away from the bank would suggest that this really was a massive new area. As we've mentioned before, there were obviously no quest guides upon release, so every time you discovered that a new item was needed to traverse further into the dungeon, or if you had to restock on food, you had to turn around and double back after obtaining the necessary item, leaving you with one fewer crucial inventory slot for food each time. Or, if you brought teleport runes to save time on the way out, that was another 2 or 3 inventory slots wasted on anything but food and potions. And don't forget that in Classic, armor and weapons were worn straight out of the inventory, not a separate equipment menu, and there was no home teleport spell. Inventory space was at a premium when you really needed it the most, and more likely than not, you would have died a few times and lost all of your stuff while trying to complete this quest, having to gather it all again and again. No doubt, the lead developer of the quest, Mod Tom, had a bet going with his colleagues at Jagex about how long it would take for the first players to successfully complete the quest. Needless to say, they probably owed him a lot of drinks at the pub by the end of the week. March 17th, 2003. St. Paddy's Day once again. The developers of the Observatory quest must have already been drunk when they decided to name the main character of this quest Professor Mambo Duna Runa Groningen. No, seriously, that's his real name in the game, according to his assistant. Of course, with this update, we also saw the release of the Observatory and its dungeon, but we also got our first exposure to the constellations. I'm sure many of us thought this was just some obscure RuneScape lore until meeting that crazy girl from the internet in the distant future and finding out people actually believe this crap means something. Imagine excitedly telling her that you once met one of the constellation's spirits at the then new Graveyard of Scorpius in-game. This part of the update doesn't have much significance today, but back then, it was still pretty important in that the Spirit of Scorpius has the ability to bless the new player-suggested unholy symbols, the antithesis of holy symbols. In Classic, an unholy symbol gave a single point stat bonus in aim, power, and armor, alongside a +6 prayer bonus, compared to the otherwise statless holy symbol with a +8 prayer bonus. In Old School today, they both give +8 prayer bonus, but the holy symbol gives +2 bonus to all defensive stats, and the unholy symbol gives +2 bonus to all offensive stats. Pretty useful in context. While this update blurred the lines between religion and pseudoscience, it wouldn't be until the date of our next update when we would see some real science. April 14th, 2003. On this very date, Human Genome Project completed its work sequencing 99% of the human genome. However, there was one far more important ongoing development. If you lived in North America, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker had just been released by Nintendo. Without this game, we wouldn't have half of the non-RuneScape music used in old school RuneScape videos on YouTube. It really seems to be every content creator's favorite soundtrack. You know, I don't know what it is, but there's just something about the cheery, peaceful, and hopeful Outset Island theme that works so well with brutal player killing in PvP.
Bro. No shot.
As long as we're already talking about things in RuneScape trying to kill you, we also saw yet another map expansion on this date with the release of the Caridian Desert. You know, the one place in game where the environment itself actively tries to kill you via severe dehydration. There really wasn't much to do here besides the tourist trap quest, so X-Rakeen would probably have finished his Deserted series in just a matter of hours if he tried it in Classic. You know, that 1% of the human genome that went unsequenced must have included the gene for having the propensity for torturing oneself by making a snowflake Iron Man with brutal restrictions and overly ambitious goals. If they had sequenced that gene, the scientists involved may have killed the project right then and there. About 2 weeks after this update, we did see the release of a project that would eventually get killed, unfortunately. Although the show previously existed in another form, April 28th was the first time the video game review show X-Play aired under its iconic name and with its two most famous hosts together, Adam Sessler and Morgan Webb, a couple of living legends. Speaking of legendary performances, May 7th, 2003. Arsenal began what would go on to become their 49-match unbeaten streak on their way to their last Premier League championship. Unfortunately, I didn't have as much fortune as I found myself getting one-shot by an unexpected blue dragon when I didn't know that I needed my anti-dragon shield during the Watchtower quest, also released on this date. Death carried a very heavy price in Classic, so the odds of retrieving your gear in 2 minutes on the other side of the map from Lumbridge, which had no bank, to an area that requires specific quest items to access, were essentially zero. And those quest areas were so off the beaten path that the odds of anyone being able to recover your gear were slim as well. And even if someone did recover your gear, you know they would just keep it for themselves, as I would go on to learn the hard way here. But with that quest also came the release of the Ogre City of Gutanoth, as well as an expansion of Feldip Hills, including the infamous Death Rune spawn surrounded by wolves that never lose aggression, maybe thwarting some less sophisticated bots from camping a spawn. World hopping wasn't much of a thing back then prior to the release of SwiftKit or Swift Switch for RuneScape 2. So if you wanted these death runes, you had to camp out one world and just pick up the death rune each time it spawned. Unfortunately, this really was one of the best, most reliable ways to obtain your own death runes in the entire game besides buying them. And before you guessed that trading cats for death runes would be better, they hadn't been released just yet, but upon release could only be traded for 25 death runes in West Ardone rather than 100 or 200 today. You can tell a lot of runecrafting haters in Old School never played Classic, because if they had, they would really appreciate the skill making it possible to reliably acquire these previously rare runes. June 9th, 2003. Earlier we mentioned a team who wears red and hasn't won any championships in over 20 years, but they aren't the only one. The NHL's New Jersey Devils won their last ever Stanley Cup on this date, led by goalie Marty Brodeur, who even pitched a cup-clinching shutout, successfully waffleboarding away all 24 shots on net. This Game 7 finished with the Anaheim Mighty Ducks getting killed 3-0, but that wasn't the murder we were interested in investigating on this date. In RuneScape, we saw the release of the Murder Mystery Quest, and therefore, a map expansion of the Sinclair Mansion, the perfect quest for your friend who's so much of a true crime junkie that they're really excited when summoned for jury duty. Here we had to pretend to be Hercule Poirot and investigate the murder of Lord Sinclair. After collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses, we put all the pieces together and came to the conclusion that it had to be one of his children. Although there was a lot of evidence incriminating all of the children, in fact, it was none other than the oldest son, Bob. Or maybe it was really Anna, and she framed her younger brother. Or maybe they were all in on it together. It's hard to blame the Sinclair children when their father started with the letter A when naming his first child and moved down a letter of the alphabet every time he wanted to choose a new name for a new child. It really makes you wonder if he also fathered another 20 illegitimate children to flesh out the rest of the alphabet, including a victim of the Drainer bank robbery, a nearly identical sibling who only shows up around the holidays, and the last one who hated her family so much that she moved far away to be an herbalist in Narda. The very next day after this murder mystery update, NASA launched its Spirit rover to study the Martian planet, Mars. The rover notably discovered some rocks that had been previously modified by water, suggesting that the planet may have once been home to water, and therefore, perhaps even life. Alien life? July 9th, 2003. Just 5 days before the United States finally admitted that Area 51 really exists. You know, that place where a bunch of feeble, meme-spamming anime nerds who are normally too afraid to ask for more ketchup for their tendies decided to organize a mass event to Naruto run past the US military with the desperate hopes of clapping some alien cheeks back in 2019. The extent of their plan for the raid was literally just, they can't stop all of us. Unfortunately, because it was a public Facebook event, the government had more than enough time and notice to move all of the aliens to Area 52 until the wannabe trespassers decided they had enough sunlight for that decade and all went home, probably needing to catch up on dozens of new episodes of One Piece that probably released in the mere 48 hours they were away from home. Anyway, maybe Jagex should use this raid as inspiration for Raids 4 in Old School that they hinted toward at RuneFest earlier this year. So, while that nonsense may have been a major public discovery if they had been successful, we actually made a much more substantial discovery of another ancient civilization and their god during RuneScape's groundbreaking Dig Site quest. As the name of the quest would suggest, the world map, of course, saw the release of the Dig Site and its exam center, as well as some areas below ground infested by spooky, scary skeletons. This was our first real evidence of the existence of Zeros and how Zamorak had used the Staff of Armadil to switch places with it. July 28th, 2003. Speaking of switching places, the world was about to see the release of the completely original film, Freaky Friday, the following week. No wait, not that version, the remake. No wait, not that remake, the older remake. No, the one with Lindsay Lohan. No, the prequel to that one. There we go. Anyway, as I was saying, this was a completely original movie idea that's never been done before. After some rough years in her career, I'm just glad that Lindsay Lohan was able to turn her life around, starring in a couple of Hallmark tier Christmas movies in previous years. At least her acting career is doing a lot better than her British twin sister's career. I haven't seen her in anything since The Parent Trap, and that movie is even older than RuneScape. Now, this date also saw the release of the pre-construction skill Lumberyard and Gertrude's house, as well as the ability to have your own pet cat. Gertrude Fairweather was the supposedly married but de facto single mom, crazy cat lady neighbor whose 4 kids probably have 4 different dads, since her husband, Walter Fairweather, travels for work for 20 plus years at a time, apparently. The introduction of pet cats and Gertrude's lack of loyalty begs the question, where are the pet dogs? They're the bravest and most fiercely loyal of all pets. My sausage dog fears nothing but the bins on trash pickup day, and it would be nice to have an equally loyal and brave companion to join us in-game. In the RuneScape 3 timeline, we didn't get pet dogs until the release of the summoning skill in January 2008. But in Old School, we have yet to get any pet dogs unless you count the Hell Puppy or Bloodhound. There was a Game Jam proposal 3 years ago addressing this erroneous omission from the game, but nothing ever came of it, unfortunately. However, rest assured that one day we will get them, and that day will be legendary. There was also one last small map update worth pointing out on this date as well. Just west of Tutorial Island, you can see two identical pairs of ships. That's because this date also saw the release of the game's third ever minigame, the Fishing Trawler. Since there were no true instances in Classic, Jagex improvised by placing 4, but really only 2, fishing trawlers on every world. One ship for the first half of the game, and the other for when it takes on water at the end. I think Jagex significantly overestimated how popular the minigame would be, especially since a relatively high fishing level was required to even benefit from the only unique rewards of high healing manta rays and sea turtles. What Jagex significantly underestimated was how dedicated their most legendary players would be to RuneScape as a whole. August 20th, 2003. As RuneScape Classic drew to a close, it seems appropriate to reflect back on the legends who helped to shape the game. Rab, RuneScape's first ever player. Blue Rose 13X, the first to level 99 magic and level 99 smithing, single-handedly made all of the earliest adamant and rune items. PKS, the first to 99 fishing and cooking. Latangel, the first to 99 crafting, who crafted many of the higher level jewelry items for us. The Old Knight, a humble, rank number 1 overall, who had no problem striking up a conversation with anyone, and just the second player to eventually reach level 99 in all skills. Zezima, another one of the early game's top players, and the first to reach level 99 in all skills eventually, whom many of us would consider to be the greatest RuneScape player of all time. It only seems fitting that the 50th and final quest in RuneScape Classic would be dedicated to them, and give each of us the opportunity to feel like we too could join these legends with the release of the Legends quest. This quest was actually incredibly difficult at the time, not just because of the skill requirements, but also because of the unique dangers of the boss fights, but more on that later. With the release of this quest, the map expanded once again with the Karazi jungle above ground and the Vieldi caves just below that. These dangerous new areas, home to these Estonian chickens, were only able to be reached by the game's very best and most skilled players. And much like other contemporary areas in the game, these places were being developed concurrently in both RuneScape Classic and RuneScape 2, generally around the same time. It's why these places never quite got the same graphical overhaul that other places received upon the migration to RuneScape 2, and why they've been mostly untouched after over 20 years. Those brave enough and strong enough to venture to these new areas could find themselves rewarded with a new best-in-slot shield and best-in-slot cape, not only for defense, but far more importantly, for fashionscape. One interesting feature in the caves that gets overlooked on most playthroughs would have to be these strange barrels that can spawn all sorts of random foes and items. It begs the question how these creatures fit into these barrels, and how they survive without food and water in this isolated room deep into a dungeon that only the most skilled can traverse. Like, how does a level 6 mugger, for example, get in here past all of the skill checks on the way in? The only explanation is that these barrels are magic and teleport random enemies and items from all over the map to you. One of the possible enemies that can spawn is a Dark Wizard, the notorious killer of noobs south of Varrock. Wouldn't it be amusing if these barrels could be collected and opened anywhere so that Dark Wizards could pick off bots anywhere if you get lucky enough with your RNG? What's also interesting is the certificate drop table of the barrels. Once again, this is one of those relics of RuneScape Classic still in the game today because it never got fixed back in March 2004, or ever again for that matter. I hope they never update these old places as a proper relic of days gone by. But speaking of relics of days gone by, September 22nd, 2003. This fall saw the release of some iconic classic Flash animations like Badger Badger Mushroom, The End of the World, 55, and Clayworld by Nox. This was really the beginning of the era of Newgrounds, E-Bombs World, Albino Black Sheep, and plenty of other non-centralized nostalgic websites that preceded the consolidation of videos on YouTube. But while one era began, another came to an end. Jagex released its final true map update of RuneScape Classic with the Mage Arena. That's right, this would be both the final version of the game and the final version of this world map until RuneScape Classic eventually shut down. Those brave enough to venture to the deepest depths of the wilderness and who had achieved a daunting level 60 magic could battle it out here to earn another best in slot cape for magic and arguably for Fashionscape as well if you couldn't cut it as a legend. Many of you may recognize this update as the final content update of RuneScape Classic, besides Halloween and the Scythe, and therefore the final world map. And you'd technically be correct. However, I would argue we actually had at least one more map update to RuneScape Classic. August 6th, 2018. Europe and the UK were at the tail end of a brutal, deadly heat wave. In the UK, temperatures reached a peak of 35 degrees Celsius, or 96 degrees in freedom units, alongside up to 100% humidity. That may not sound out of the ordinary for those of you in the American South or Australian Outback, but they don't exactly have much in the way of infrastructure to handle temperatures or humidity like that in Europe. Europeans mostly lack air conditioning, and also lack the necessary power grid to support its widespread use anyway. It makes you wonder why they don't invest more in nuclear energy. They even lack other essentials to beat the heat, like proper lemonade or iced tea in the American South, or full blue flavored Pop Tops from Woolies in Australia. How was anyone expected to survive weather like that without those crucial beverages? The very thought of a cold beverage probably triggers the average Brit to put on the kettle instinctively. As such, sacrifices had to be made to lower the heat. Jagex even had to make the difficult decision to literally pull the plug on their last remaining RuneScape Classic servers to help lower the heat in their office and beyond. Well, it must have worked because the UK's heat wave, and this is true, came to an end quite literally the very next day. It turns out that it uses a lot of power to run a bunch of bot accounts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Coincidence? I think not. Unfortunately, while that's all mostly true, the real story of our final update to the RuneScape Classic World Map, if you even want to call it that, is a bit sadder than that of a noble sacrifice. The few real players who remained couldn't justify to Jagex the cost of keeping the servers going. At the same time, there were game-breaking bugs like permanently breaking the crystal chest in Taverly and security vulnerabilities like PID swapping. Also, most of the players online were just bots running 24/7 with impunity. Well, it turns out that no one left at Jagex in 2018 had any idea how any of this ancient spaghetti code worked, and there wasn't really much value in anyone trying to learn it at this point. You know, this may come as a surprise to many of you because of my Great Lakes accent, but my dad is actually Jagex. It's often difficult to get his attention in a magnificent game because he's lost in wonder. We were playing RuneScape Classic together years ago, and I asked him what it would cost to fix the broken spaghetti code today, and I'll never forget his answer. We can't. We don't know how to do it. As such, Jagex gave us about 3 months notice that they were just going to shut the game down for good. And they did shut it down. Scheduled for 8 AM on August the 6th. A bunch of us old-timers gathered together one last time in the game to see it off properly. I'm sure many of you watching this were even there with me in Draenor Village that day, trading original or maybe even duplicated, discontinued holiday items and other rares. In fact, that's me right there. But not all of us were there in Draenor Village. Deep within the treacherous and savage jungles of Karamja, Twitch streamer Titus Furious was in a race against the clock. He had started a goal to complete all quests on his original Classic account, and so far, he had completed 49 out of 50, with only the Legends quest left to complete before the server shut down. Keep in mind, this quest might be relatively easy by today's standards in Old School, but this quest was actually extremely long and incredibly difficult in Classic. It was almost impossible to pray melee or eat against the demon, and you had to beat him in a fight numerous times. And don't forget that death carried a heavy price in Classic, especially this far from any teleports. Any death could permanently end the run, and unfortunately, Titus fell victim to the demon Nezakined. 8 AM was quickly approaching in the UK, and Titus was close, but not close enough to finishing the quest. The clock hit 0 on the shutdown, with about 15 to 20 minutes left in the quest. It was now 8 a.m. It was too late. He didn't make it. But then, a miracle happened. Jagex caught wind of this one final effort and actually delayed the shutdown just for him. Jagex gave Titus just enough time to take another shot at it. The RuneScape Classic community was closely watching and quickly rallied to resupply him. He returned to the Karazi jungle and slayed the Scourge of the Jungle. The madman actually did it, and the community celebrated accordingly. It took 15 years, but Titus became a true legend that day, and even made the news for it. The last and final legend of RuneScape Classic. Eventually, the celebrations ended, as the end of the world was finally upon us. A 17-and-a-half-year journey in this world finally came to an end, and we got the very last update to this version of the world map. Xaners came crashing down to destroy the world, and the remnants must have been sucked into Thwarter's black hole, because everything and everyone got permanently banned that day. And there we have it. The final map of RuneScape Classic. A desolate, barren void, frozen in time forever. But our story doesn't have to end there. Let's rewind time 14 and a half years to March 2004 and start on a new branch of the RuneScape timeline. The next update on this new branch would be the largest and arguably most important world map update of all time, with the transformation of the entire world map and also some new in-game content that surprised even Jagex. Be sure to subscribe so you can find out all about this and more in the next episode as we move on to RuneScape 2.
This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Hey guys, what's up? Mad Season here, back with another video for you. So something quite interesting is happening within the world of MMOs, and I'm kind of caught in the middle of it actually. So I wanted to make a video talking about it for you here. Basically, if you don't know what's going on recently, there's been kind of a migration going on, if you will, from World of Warcraft to old school RuneScape. Some people are happy, some are neutral. A lot are quite angry, as MMO players tend to be, and I kind of wanted to analyze this situation here because it is quite interesting, I think. So, long story short, in October of last year, I decided to dip my toes into the wonderful world of Gielinor. There really wasn't much going on with World of Warcraft during the time that I was interested in personally, and inspired by another channel, Jimmy, who came over to WoW as a new player, I decided to sort of match that and do the same with OSRS, and it's been really fun. And more recently, within the past month or so, there's actually been a bunch of WoW channels that are checking it out as well, and it's kind of blown up at this point, and there's this huge wave of optimism with OSRS, and this huge wave of pessimism with World of Warcraft. Because, at least at the moment, Blizzard is kind of struggling with what to do with Classic. But do you know what developer isn't struggling? Are you tired of waiting for World War III to officially kick off so we can be sent to our glorious nuclear Armageddon? Well, wait no longer. Bring war to your depressing bedroom with the free-to-play War Thunder, Commander Mad Season's favorite game on the Citadel. PC, PlayStation, Xbox, mobile, tanks, planes, helicopters, ships. Oh my. With over 2,500 options from 10 major nations, from all the timelines to blow shit up. Or get yourself blown up. With the X-ray feature, which shows you to the very last detail just why you're bad at video games. Whether it be its sound effects or graphics. With over 70 million players engaging in massive PvP battles, you think you want to play, and you do. And between the engines, fuel tanks, and weapons, Each part of these machines, including the crew members who operate them, are susceptible to damage and are fully customizable, such as this historically accurate anime decal. All that's needed is you, keyboard, a couple of energy drinks, and an abundance of free time on a Friday night. Click my links in the pinned comment or description. If you're a new or returning player who hasn't played for 6 months on PC and console, you'll get the limited time massive bonus pack, which includes the Eagle of Valor exclusive vehicle decoration, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium. Anyways, memes aside, as you would expect, things have gotten pretty toxic and tribalistic, as MMOs tend to unfortunately be. And I just want to say I would like to avoid that. I personally think it's unproductive. It might feel like that at moments in this video because that just kind of naturally happens when you compare two things next to each other and two developers next to each other, but hopefully that's not the vibe the video gives off. I think both games are cool in their own right. The community opinion is very much leaning one way right now, but it's far from beyond redemption, as I'll explain. So a lot of people are kind of taking this as WoW bad. Primarily Classic is bad because OSRS is, of course, also a classic recreation, so they kind of draw this similar audience, and there's just no interest in World of Warcraft Classic anymore, which is a half-truth. I'm not sure about retail. I haven't really kept up to date, aside from this abomination you're staring at.
My brand!
Small indie game dev, by the way. This is the kind of quality content that record-breaking microtransaction profits gets you, I guess, so shoutouts to that. But as far as Classic is concerned, there's actually a massive interest in it. It's just that there's not much interest right now due to how Blizzard has sort of structured it. And for this, there are definitely a few reasons, starting with number one here, and that's meaningful progression. And what I mean by that is the time that you put into the game isn't made to be irrelevant within a year, or heck, even a few months later. You may have seen this. There's actually been a lot of people who have been talking about this. It's kind of becoming a thing as the MMORPG genre evolves. Heck, even the latest ad from OSRS outright mentions it.
Tired of chasing gear that'll be worthless next patch? In old school RuneScape, your progress actually matters. No resets, no seasons, no FOMO. Just you and your grind.
So, this is what's called horizontal versus vertical progression. If you don't know, vertical progression is essentially character progression such that when new content is released, it replaces old content or otherwise makes it irrelevant or far less relevant in some way. This is how Modern WoW has done it for a very long time. At first it was with new expansion releases. You know, BC comes out, vanilla gear is mostly useless by the time you reach level 70. But now it's actually done by patch. Like when patch 10.1 releases, 10.0 content is replaced within a few days, and you never go back again to the raid content of 10.0. And when 10.2 releases, the same is true for 10.1, and so on and so forth. And you may be asking, okay, why would they do that? I definitely see the appeal in a fresh start, but every 4 or 5 months or so, or whenever they release patches these days, kind of seems to be a bit much, especially in a genre of game which is centered around character progression. Now me, I personally have a little theory that this is done in order to sell more WoW tokens, since progression is now essentially resetting every patch as opposed to every expansion, and when progression resets, WoW tokens sell because people are buying new BOEs, they're buying all of their new enchants and, you know, tertiary trade skill stuff to catch up to the new content. But I digress. That's its own whole cringe 1 hour rant that I already did many years ago. So I'm going to save that for another video maybe. Getting back on subject here, vertical progression versus horizontal. Now, horizontal, on the other hand, avoids this self-cannibalization, and the game only grows in impactful things to do, while at the same time avoiding making existing systems and features or places or the time spent invested into them irrelevant. Just recently they released some more content. There's a new area in the game, and by releasing this area, it doesn't make anywhere else in the world irrelevant. The entire world of Gielinor and all the things to do in it are still valuable and they still matter. In fact, in some cases they matter more. Soon they'll be releasing a new skill called Sailing, and by releasing this, not only does it not make the other skills like magic, hunting, herb lore, or any of the other ones irrelevant, it in fact can make them more relevant due to the way that skills interact with each other in this game. And I know what a lot of people are going to say, it's apples and oranges, the games are too different to be compared to one another, but even vanilla World of Warcraft, as theme park as it is, has this perfect example. When the Blackwing Lair comes out, you still want to do the Molten Core. In fact, many guilds are still doing the Molten Core even when the final raid, Naxxramas, is out, because there are a few key items in there that are still really good, even at that raid tier. So, although I would say it isn't as much as a game like OSRS, which is obviously much more sandbox, these things, combined with the loot being so diverse in vanilla, creates this sort of horizontal progression aspect where even early raid tiers are relevant enough to where guilds still run them when the new raids come out. In fact, it's one of the things that makes vanilla so unique, because from this point onward is when they started moving more towards this vertical style of progression. Of course, with the first expansion, the Burning Crusade, raising the level cap like I mentioned, and erasing 99% of the gear by the time you reach Nagrand. So, coming back to OSRs for a moment, and this is one of its greatest strengths, the entire way that it's been crafted provides security and longevity, where if you feel burnt out, or if you just have real life stuff happen, which happens to all of us, obviously, by the time you come back, you don't have what is essentially this irrelevant dead character to regrind. You have retained your progress, and if you don't believe me on that, let's just look at the numbers. Numbers don't lie. So OSRS officially relaunched in 2013, so it has a 6-year head start before Classic, which is important to note, but similar to Classic WoW, it was the original old school version of the game. Jagex, much like Blizzard, kind of went off the rails with the game, from what I understand, which is now referred to as RuneScape 3. It gained this whole new identity, in a large way motivated to try to appeal to WoW players, ironically enough. And although I haven't played it personally, I hear nothing but terrible things about it. It supposedly has one of the most effed up and predatory microtransaction systems, even by today's standards. And on that note, I also hope that this video doesn't come off as me fanboying Jagex and shitting on Blizzard. Although I'm definitely more happy with Jagex right now, the side I'm on is the player side. I think what's happened with Blizzard over the course of the past decade is a perfect example of what loyalty to a developer gets you. In my opinion, the only side you should be loyal to is you, the player, because by doing that, you're forcing these developers to compete against each other for your dollar. But we'll get into that later. I'm getting ahead of myself. But anyways, as you can see, when OSRS first launched, it saw this big surge of popularity, much like Classic WoW 2019, and like Classic WoW, things slowly tapered off because it's an MMO. There's nothing abnormal or anything the developers have done wrong at this point. It's just how MMOs work. There's this huge surge of popularity and then a drop-off. This is common, especially if there's this foreseeable finish line in the future, because guess what? Finish lines erase security. The entire genre from its inception is based off of the fact that it never ends. Day one, that's what MMOs were all about. If you run out of things to do, the developers add more things to do in order to keep you subscribed. Failing that, the game loses one of its greatest strengths, and it'll just retain this very baseline amount of really super hardcore dedicated players who just really love the world so much that they are content with it never changing. But as great as all that is, the large majority of that initial surge will quote-unquote complete the game, as much as you can complete an MMO, and then move on to another one that are actually offering new and exciting things. And I mention this, and it's really, really important because this is where these two developers diverge and has led us to the situation today. So what exactly is this split? Well, whereas Blizzard went down the route of re-releasing expansions, which carried a certain amount of vanilla classic players with them, because this is where the new content lies, as they stopped updating vanilla. They had classic era servers, but they just kept it at the final 1.12 patch, which kept a baseline amount of players, like I said, but that's it. But over on the OSRS side of things, something interesting started to happen. They had stayed with the original game in this original world, but essentially started doing OSRS Plus, what classic players have been fiending for a very long time if you're at all involved with the community. So for OSRS, as you can imagine, this was the original game in the original world, with changes and updates added in the spirit of this original game. Changes that were added in a non-cannibalistic way that didn't destroy time investment and character progression, and complete with polls voted on by the players to make sure that it stays on track, and they also have some sort of say in it. And as you can see, as the numbers show, after this initial surge, OSRS wasn't really that popular. It was only after they started adding these new features and areas and quests true to this original flavor is when something interesting started to happen. The game, instead of declining, although very slowly, started to grow and grow, like Rosie O'Donnell's penis, until today, where everyone's now realized, oh shit, this game's pretty damn good. And most importantly, there's no end in sight. Huge content like new areas and bosses and skills, to small fixes and optimizations. The game gets updated every 2 weeks, if you can believe that. New areas, activities, enemies, items, whatever. And over the course of the past 12 years, it's now in a position where it's setting new records every day, and it's really paying dividends. So we contrast this with World of Warcraft, which mystifyingly has gone down the same path of expansions, but we'll save that for later. For now, let's focus more on vanilla, since I think that's really more comparable here. As you know, they've relied primarily on these temporary seasons. There was the Season of Mastery, which had some endgame raid balance changes, and their most recent Discovery, which had much more impactful stuff like class changes, tons of new stuff, profession items, rebalancing, new low-level raids and whatnot, which we'll talk about. Some of it within the realm of what people commonly request of Classic Plus, but ultimately quite a lot of it outside of it, as, I don't know, you guys have seen people really want rogue tanks and no Murgon raids in their version of Classic Plus, which I personally have not seen, but it is what it is, I guess. But even still, whatever the case is, the issue is the same. They eventually end. You can't put in a couple months of time and then, with any confidence, come back a year later and continue where you left off at the same level. And not only that, but if any substantial amount of time has passed, if you have the knowledge that the season is going to end, why would you start midway through? This was made especially worse with how closed-mouthed they were with when their season was going to end. Near the end, they were actually putting out Classic Plus-esque content like a Scarlet Monastery raid and an Ashbringer questline, but why would you start and play it if, for all that you know, it could end in 3 months, 2 months, 1 month? They have created zero security that your investment and progression will retain value in a genre of game that's centered around time investment and character progression. Perfect example here, Season of Discovery, which after Phase 1 maintained fairly low numbers, I would say. That is until the very day that they announced that it was ending, and that's when everyone quit. Because, of course, it's common sense. Why would you play? Why invest so much time into this time-consuming genre centered around character progression when you know you will not retain any of this progression? Knowing that an MMO will end or your time spent will be made to be irrelevant is one of the most demotivating things that a player can experience. And this all may seem obvious to you, in which case the question then becomes, well, why has Blizzard structured their games in this way? Well, yeah, I don't know. Don't look at me, I'm asking the same question here. I'm actually very curious about that. In fact, Discovery was especially egregious with this due to its phase system and the way they capped off levels. At first it was level 20, and then 30, and 40, with each new phase essentially dismantling the work and time invested in the previous phase, kind of following this retail structure of when new patches releases, everything you did in the previous patch is replaced within a few days. And, you know, hindsight is 2020 for sure, but, I mean, once again, as you can see by the drop-off, huge wave of popularity in Phase 1, followed by a pretty sharp decline. And, in fact, if you ask people who played Discovery, it's pretty common for them to say, well, Phase 1 was really awesome, but after that it was kind of lame. So, you know, just thinking about it here, it's really no wonder why the situation is as it is right now. Having this genre of game defined by its longevity and erasing people's time investment and work is one of the most mystifying things about this whole situation. Not only are Blizzard destroying people's progression on a macro level, with the seasons themselves ending, they're also doing it on a micro level in between these different phasing systems. And again, there's value in a fresh start, but how much is too much? And I think clearly, as we could tell by the situation currently going on, this is too much. The simple fact of the matter is that OSRS has been designed to grow, and World of Warcraft, nearly every version of the game, has been designed to surge and then burn out immediately, and you now see the former reaping the rewards of that long-term design, as it's now been over a decade of these faithful, non-cannibalistic content added to the game. Even if you played OSRS at its launch in 2013, played it for a few months or a year, haven't touched it since, maybe you got 99 mining, that skill is just as relevant today as it was back then. In fact, probably more so, because they've added more content and activities relating to the skill, and you can just jump in and enjoy those. So this is the split. When Blizzard had the opportunity to do the exact same thing, they instead chose to throw their game and their players' time investment into a recycler, and despite how much time you put into it, you're still where you left off, square one, and any time you put into Mastery or Discovery has resulted in only memories, while the 2019 version follows the same path that led to its very creation. So let's talk about this. I just fail to get it, maybe? My mind is kind of blown with this whole situation. It's like if Jagex, instead of doing what they're doing with OSRS, they instead re-released it and then followed through with the changes that eventually turned it into RuneScape 3, thereby repeating the same mistakes and setting players down the very same path that created the desire for old school RuneScape to begin with. It sounds insane. In fact, it literally is the definition of insanity, repeating the same thing and expecting different results, but that's what Blizzard is doing. I shit you not, we're almost at the point where they're about to re-release the Warlords of Mother Effing Draenor, okay? It's like, what's the point? The most entertainment that expansion brought was sitting half AFK in your garrison, arguing about politics and trade chat. This is one of the main driving forces of this migration that's happening right now. It's no secret. Everyone's talking about it. This isn't a groundbreaking video. OSRS is making ads based off of it. World of Warcraft and OSRS are two very different games, and you can't directly compare them together. That's very true. One is a sandbox, the other is a theme park, but if you say that, they can at the very least learn from one another. My reply is that, well, you'd make a very great Blizzard developer because it's an incredibly obtuse and unproductive way of looking at things. In any creative body, you have to have the ability to put your ego aside and say, oh, you know what, this competitor did this thing really well. I'm going to retain my identity, but I'm also going to learn from it to improve the product that I am putting out. And the knowledge that Blizzard can glean from this to improve their game for you is building off of this strong base in a non-cannibalistic way and reappreciating this core fundamental appeal that the MMO genre has had day one, security and longevity, and to not disrespect the player's time by setting them back to square one every few months. It isn't some grand revelation. In fact, it's always been the elephant in the room with vanilla specifically. Day one, it was that, okay, what happens after Naxxramas? The issue with re-releases within the MMO genre is that, of course, the second time around, the finish line is common knowledge. In 2004, most people didn't even know what an expansion was, let alone its implications. Knowing this finish line limits its potential severely, and this is the answer that's staring them right in the face. Keep the original game, add content in line in its original spirit, go on this alternative pathway from the Outland, stay in the original 2 continents, and create new content and memories with your community as your ally and partner, and use them to help guide you, because chances are they probably know the game more than you. A handful of a few dozen developers do not know more than the hundreds of thousands of community of players who have played the game for the past 20 years. But whatever the case is, relying on these temporary servers has caused vanilla to fall far short of its actual potential. And even saying that, OSRS also does have these temporary seasons, but they're integrated into the main game. They're called leagues. They launch every now and then, and they have accelerated progression similar to classic seasons, but instead of just solely being their own thing that ends, by participating in them, you earn a currency that you can spend in the main game to unlock cosmetic rewards as kind of a show of your participation for that league. The main game doesn't end when they're finished, and they're used to shake up the experience and at the same time progress the main game in various ways, because from what I understand, they also use them as a testing ground, and if there's an element that the players really liked in a particular league, they implement it into the mainline OSRS after conferring once again with the player base. And in the cases of features that the players didn't like, oh well, it's just a side league, and it's not the only thing to play, and there's always still new, more grounded stuff being developed every day. So again, another feature that, in my opinion, has been far more thought out and well done. Who knows, they may have even gotten the idea from Blizzard, and they were able to put their ego aside, learn from it, do better, and still retain their original identity and leverage ideas from your competitor without ripping them off to make your game better and your community happier. So between the way that the game itself is constructed and with it using seasons as a supplement, as opposed to relying on them exclusively like World of Warcraft is doing right now, Jagex is offering something that Blizzard isn't, and it's a large reason why you see this exodus. Maybe they thought that Pandaria Classic would fill the gap, but it isn't, because it's not vanilla. In fact, this very same expansion is directly one of the ones that made people yearn for vanilla, because it was so out there and against the identity of what World of Warcraft is. There are people who play Warcraft and they want orcs, violence, and heavy metal, not mystical adventures in Pandaland. And it was Pandaria that really kind of made them realize, like, okay, wow, this isn't the game that I fell in love with. I want to play private servers and go back to the original version. The gap in design and feel between Mists of Pandaria and vanilla is just too large for vanilla players to be satisfied, as evidenced with this exodus. I shit you not, there are streamers right now who are refusing paid sponsorships to play Pandaria and are instead playing OSRS.
And I want to tell you that I declined a $5,000 deal to play Mists of Pandaria to fucking play this game, so put some respect on my name, man! I actually enjoyed this game. I rejected big money to play this, okay?
That's right. They literally can't pay people to play their game. Wow. Wow.